I would like to introduce the president of AIA Los Angeles, Greg Varabian, who is a design director and principal at HKS Architects. Greg Varabian, thank you.
All right, thanks, Will, and good morning, all. I just want to share a little background context or history on Encompass, just to kind of get us started here. So obviously, this is the 4th annual AIA LA Encompass, the Inclusive Architecture Conference. In early 2017, after 14 months of outreach, the AIA's Equity and Architecture Commission released the Equity and Architecture Commission report. It was the recommendations included in this report which led to our first Encompass in May of 2017. Our first 3 Encompass conferences focused on inclusive procurement opportunities and procurement reform, best practices in human resources for hiring and assembling diverse teams, workshops on adding empathy and integrity to the design process, personal stories and mentor-protege partnerships, and the added value of diversity and how inclusive firms outperform others that are less inclusive. In 2018, AILA released the EDI Best Practices Guide, basically a roadmap with actionable steps to support design practitioners. This year, with the support of a newly launched JEDI committee, Encompass will focus on urban resilience, environmental justice, and the systemic disparities caused by our zoning and land use policies. We'll also examine the stressful impacts that our ongoing pandemic is placing on students and faculty and emerging professionals. The disparate impacts of this pandemic are placed in stark relief our urgent need to diversify our AEC profession and attract and encourage more people of color to pursue careers in architecture. Not lastly, but next is, we're proud this year that we have a collaboration between AIA LA and SoCal NOMA. We encourage all firms, HKS is one of them that's doing this, to sign on to SoCal NOMA DEI Challenge, which is a 10-point commitment that delivers a pathway to diversity for Los Angeles firms through touch points, including mentorship, recruitment, and promotion, and pro bono services to underserved communities. This year's 2-part conference will conclude tomorrow with an interactive session where we want to hear from you on your responses to the following questions. 1, how would you define the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the AEC industry? And how would you define the design case for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the AEC industry? Before I turn this back over to Will, I wanted to share some news that I heard yesterday. I was on a national Zoom conference, and the 2020 national president, Jane Friedrich, noted that a partnership has officially been formed with the NAACP for the 2020 Diversity and Opportunity Report Card. In 2021, AIA operations will evaluate equitable practices within the Institute, including staffing, racial composition, procurement, and governance, and also review the existing honors and rewards programs for any implicit or explicit biases. And now, Will Wright will recognize the 2020 Encompass sponsors. It is with their generous support that AIA Los Angeles is able to advance initiatives such as Encompass, which are vital to the health of the architecture profession and to the communities in which we serve. Thank you again for joining us today, everyone. Will?
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all for joining us this morning for the 4th annual Encompass. We couldn't do programs like this without, first of all, our annual sponsors, our 2020 annual sponsors that are on the screen right now for you to look at. We're really thankful for each one of your support, and many of you are in the room right now. And it's that support, such as Greg Varabian mentioned, that is allowing us to really bring you the types of programs that serve the architecture profession. I'd like to also recognize the sponsors of Encompass. This year we have the tremendous support of Unibel, Rodamco Westfield. We also have ZGF, the Penta Building Group, Steinberg Hart, HKS Architects, KFA, NAC Architecture, PCL Construction Services, Hanson LA, Bernard's, and Co-Architects. Once again, thank you so much for helping us bring this program to you today and tomorrow. And with that, I look forward to welcoming the moderators of panel number 1. We have Kevin Holland, FAIA, and Ziba. Welcome, and we look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I want to give you a little intro about our panel. As you know, the theme of our panel is "We are all in this together," which is a conversation on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Today, we want to explore boundaries beyond our immediate architecture workplace and have an honest conversation that can inspire ideas on how our profession should come together, unite itself, and take this historic opportunity to accelerate diversity and inclusion. Along with my partner, Kevin Holland, we are delighted to moderate an outstanding panel that bring a wide range of perspective from within and outside of our profession, as well as the education sector. I now want to invite our panel to give 30 seconds of introduction, opening remarks. And I'd like to start with Carol Wedge, CEO, Shepley Bulfinch.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Wedge. I'm the CEO of Shepley Bulfinch, and I'm also the current chair of the Large Firm Roundtable, which is a national organization that has 60 of the largest firms as members. And we've been doing a lot of interesting work around justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity for several years. And so I'm very excited to be with you today.
Thank you, Carol. Marcus Rees, Executive Vice President of Public Affairs, Unibar Rademco Westville.
Thank you, Ziba, and good morning. Pleasure to be with you. I manage our government affairs, community affairs, and corporate communications efforts, as well as our D&I efforts in working alongside Ziba. And again, happy to be with you.
Thank you, Marcus. Marcelo Oliva is an architecture professor at LATTC and lead Career by Design LA.
Hey team, good morning. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Careers by Design LA is the largest initiative for professional jobs in the architecture, engineering, and construction by Mayors Garcetti, Workforce Development, Careers by Design LA. I've been teaching for 30 years at a community college with the most diverse student body, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcela. John Padilla with Padilla Architects.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I've got a small firm out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I practice in New Mexico and regionally in the states of Colorado and Arizona. My experience with AIA has been as former regional director on the AIA National Board. I've also served as vice president on the National AIA Board. Most recently served as the AIA secretary. I currently represent the AIA to the Pan American Federation of Association of Architects, which includes all of Latin America, North America, South America, and the Caribbean. I'm excited about being a part of the panel and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And finally, Kimberly Dowdell, Principal HOK and National NOMA President.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Kimberly Dowdell. I'm the 2019-2020 National President of NOMA, which I think most of you have heard of at this point, but it's a national organization of minority architects founded almost 50 years ago, so 1971. So we're excited about celebrating 50 years next year. One of the things that we're most proud of is just building more bridges, within the architectural community to really foster the sense of belonging that everyone deserves in the profession. So creating more access to the profession, fostering leadership, and celebrating the legacy of our members. And in addition to NOMA, I'm a principal at HOK in Chicago, and delighted to share my thoughts with the panel, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kimberly. Kevin, would you give us a little bit about what we're going to do today?
Yes, thank you, Ziba. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating. I'm glad to see a full house, so to speak. My name is Kevin Holland. I am the founder and managing principal of the newly formed K. Michael Architects, also a past national president of NOMA, as well as the current board secretary of AIA Los Angeles. Okay, so let's get into it. The focus and the objective of today's panel. We've had, since last year, we've had quite a challenging 2020 and 2019 since our last gathering of Encompass. It's no secret, everyone knows, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, the shooting of Jacob Blake in the back 7 times in Kenosha. This is the dark cloud that currently hovers over us as we begin this symposium and this conversation on race and diversity. Can we afford to ignore these things? Do we believe that there is no correlation between race relations in the street and race relations in corporate America, or specifically race relations in our architecture firms? We've all been here before. This country has had conversations on race after numerous events. The assassination of Dr. King in the late 80s, when the US companies were contemplating divestment in South Africa, and after the Rodney King verdict. And what they each had in common was civil unrest prompted a discussion on race. However, it's my contention that the previous conversations have not necessarily been honest and forthcoming. There's still widely held opinions which have permeated all aspects of society, including architecture. Are minority architects or architects of color featured prominently in leadership in your firm? If not, we must ask the question, why not? This conversation, if it's going to be successful, should make all of us uncomfortable, and we should hold a mirror up to ourselves and own our proportional culpability in the issue of race. This group has discussed and prepared responses to 5 questions that we will ask over the next 35 to 40 minutes. I will now turn the floor back over to my colleague Ziba, who will bring up the first question.
Thank you, Kevin. So with our first question, we want to find common ground among our speakers and audience. I'm going to open the first question to Marcus. Is it widely believed that discrimination impacts the social, mental, and financial well-being of those being discriminated against?
Wow. Thank you, Zebra, for that question. We're going to start off strong, I see. Look, I'll take the angle that I think I'm best suited to address, and that's maybe the financial, and to talk a bit about a discussion I had with my 9-year-old, who's now aware of kind of what's going on and has a lot of questions. And primarily, why do certain people live in certain areas and other people live in other areas? And I think it's a good sort of connecting of the dots between sort of the question when we have these discussions, which is, well, we would really love to have a more diversified firm or more diversified leadership if only we could find these people. Or, you know, we'd love to have, you know, more women in the field, but women don't tend to go toward technical fields, or people of color don't, you know, have the math skills and things of that nature. And it struck me that history in this country, particularly history around people of color, is very limited. And all you have to do is to sort of expand that a bit and go back 100 years and talk about policy. And one in particular, housing policy, because housing policy and owning houses is sort of the source, the main source of wealth in this country. And when you look at housing policy, whether it be during FDR, when you had FHA and a lot of that housing policy being enacted both on a federal and local level, it was written into the law to exclude selling houses to people of color. You could not get a bank loan if you sold to an African-American family in a number of different neighborhoods, Latino families as well. And so it was written into the very fabric of our federal policy and also our local policy around things like redlining, where people of color were not allowed to buy into certain neighborhoods that were outlined in red. And so when you walk into a boardroom now or a C-suite and you say, where are the people of color? You know, it tracks back to that, because obviously the legacy of wealth is how you send, how my grandparents sent my mother and my father to college, and how they sent me to college and provided opportunity for me. So I think the first thing we should do is to sort of expand our minds a bit and get beyond the notion that race relations in this country can be summarized in the ending of slavery, Martin Luther King, Oprah, and Tiger Woods.
Thank you, Marcus. I want to actually take this conversation and maybe ask Marcella to give us her perspective coming from education and, you know, teaching colleges in Los Angeles. How do you answer this question? Marcella, you need to.
Yeah. Sorry. Something that we should all consider is the reality of mental health. Racism, and let me share a screen for a second. So according to the US Surgeon General, the reality is that poverty, violence, racism, and discrimination play a very strong impact in our communities. I would like to bring this to your attention because the built environment is a way of oppression in our communities. And I would like to leave you with the idea that what can we do now that we understand that discrimination, oppression, our deteriorated built environment have a very strong effect on the mental health. And then stigmas appear immediately. Oh, they're not doing their homework, or they're not doing their potential at work. So how can we bring a little bit of more empathy? I want to leave it with, now that we identify the problem as an architect, as an architecture professor, let's identify also some of the things that we can do. And we can start identifying the emotions. So even that you can be the best employer or the best educational environment, if your student didn't sleep or they being bullied by their color, they're going to have very strong emotions that end up into violence or aggression or depression and so on. So this is a reality. And then as designers, we need to start creating methodologies to transform these. We don't have all the answers, but definitely this Encompass conversation starts giving some hope into our communities. So two things: racism creates mental health problems in our communities, and let's start designing solutions like, if you are close to somebody you can mentor, help them identify their emotions. And that's one way that it doesn't go as deep. So bringing some empathy and some awareness, because if you think about it time-wise, it's really recent in our history, this oppression. It wasn't too long ago. And that's my response to this issue. Be aware and start creating solutions.
Thank you, Marcella. If any of our panel would like to give comment on this question. John, I think, you know, when it comes to empathy, actually, we had a recent conversation, and there were some interesting, you know, when you talked about empathy and being human, and, you know, something that you sort of were, you grew up with, you know, do you have some nugget to actually share with us in that regard?
Well, I would like to add that you can be the best teacher, but if your student is being a bully or is being oppressed, it will be very difficult. Even as Los Angeles, you guys know, holds the largest number of immigrants in our country, and how difficult it is for them that they come as engineers, as architects, and they have to be driving taxis, they have to be working, you know, shelving boxes, and all of that lowers their self-esteem. And lowering the self-esteem on a person that looks different. As we all know, we all want to belong, even people among the same race. The number one thing we want to do as human is belong. So I, you know, experience this every day in my student body, but I also see that this creates a very strong resilience in our student body. And that desire to belong to the built environment, that desire that they can be doing something where they can integrate the harmony of nature. So even that there's a lot of negativity, I do believe that the students interested in the built environment are already enlightened. And it's for all of us that are in these positions of privilege to be there for them. And I think that's what these kind of conversations are extremely helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to actually piggyback off that, if I may. I appreciate that the title of this talk is "We're All in This Together," and I think anyone who's heard me talk about NOMA for more than 5 minutes, you've heard my All In for NOMA sort of platform that's characteristic of my my presidency for these 2 years. And all is it's an acronym for Access, Leadership, Legacy, as I mentioned earlier. But there's often the question, well, is NOMA just for Black architects? And my personal opinion is that no, we should literally all be in this together. We all should be in for NOMA, and more broadly, we should all be in for fostering the sense of belonging that everyone who wants to practice architecture can feel like they have a seat at the table and a place where they can do their best work. And so I think it's important that we, as a profession, not just an organization, but as a profession, we think about ways to make people feel welcome, to make sure that they know that they're supported, and to foster mentorship and the things that are required to really do our work, which is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And that means the entire public. So the public that includes some of the most disinvested neighborhoods in our country, and of course the more typical design projects, which are the most expensive and sort of luxury homes and larger buildings. But everywhere in between on that spectrum, there's a place for all of us. And I think that an important part of this discussion is how do we make space for all of those different voices and perspectives and backgrounds.
Absolutely. And look, I think these things are oftentimes driven by two things: one, fear; the other, indifference. And I think there's been a lot of emphasis on dealing with the fear part, which goes into nomenclature, name calling, terminology, and things of that nature, but not enough on the indifference part, which is when you walk into a room and it doesn't represent the America that we live in, then there should be a red flag for you. And I think we should all feel that red flag. And I think that the indifference is what's led us sort of into a place of complacency where we feel like it's just an unfortunate accident that we all ended up that way. And I think that we should start to view it in a different way and to say, no, there were, again, policies that were enacted that have, unfortunately, this is the legacy and the result of that. And I think that's what drives the empathy, and to start thinking more of each other and thinking of educating ourselves and really wondering why and how did we get here.
Kevin, unmute yourself.
I apologize. Kim, if we go back to your all in for NOMA, I think that's a great segue to the second question. And actually, we'll direct this first to Carol Wedge. Who is accountable to resolve the issues of racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination?
So I guess I would start with people in power are responsible for what's going on within their environment. And the more influence and seniority or ownership you have, the more voice you need to have within an organization. So whether, as Kim, as the president of NOMA, has a large voice and the ability to influence that, so do all of our representatives of our local AIA chapters, the heads of every firm. But I also think it's empowering everyone in your organization to have voice. So there's a lot of things we've done in the last year at the Large Firm Roundtable that are about, and just as Marcus says, looking at our profession and saying, why is it not more diverse? I think some of the root of it is that I don't know if it's quite indifference, as it was the expectation that I grew up in the civil rights movement. I was a child, who sort of lived in that environment, and I thought it would take care of itself. I thought that the civil rights law would take care of itself. I thought the voting rights for women would take care of itself. So I think we're all realizing that just changing policy doesn't change our cultures. And one of the things that's been on my mind is I feel like architecture has to reckon with its eliteness. And so when Kim talks about access, There's something innately elite about professions, and I think that eliteness was created with the best of intentions. So we want to give design awards for the most beautiful buildings or the most sustainable buildings. But I think we have to look at it with a new lens and to educate ourselves and really understand, are we making it more exclusive than we really want it to be, or are we making more accessible? And I think some of the things that I've seen in the last couple of years are, we had a meeting where the head of Hampton University architecture said, do you CEOs know the names of the 7 accredited HBCU's architectural programs? Not one CEO in the room could name those. 3 years later, almost everyone could name every single one. They'd probably like get lost at the last seventh, but they would eventually remember it, through their middle-aged brain. And I think that's progress. Creating connections where you're deliberately recruiting and looking for interns from those HBCUs, because that's where a majority of the licensed architects in America come from. So I think looking at your ability to influence a situation, as Marcus said, looking at a room and saying who's missing and why, and then being restless enough to try and find out how to make a difference within that. I keep thinking that this kind of the responsibility of leadership and power in architecture is the responsibility to leave the profession better than we found it. So it's the responsibility to create access and mentorship and be generous of your time and encourage people to be engaged in their built environment. And I think of how many stories of students who say to me, well, I grew up in an inner city where I could see the problems and I wanted to make a difference. And that's why I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to turn that abandoned lot into a garden or a community center. And it starts at this very human level of wanting to make change and wanting to improve a situation that you notice. And I think making those stories more tangible to the next generation of K-12 students and the students that are in architecture graduating into a downturn, there's a vibrant career here, and we're here to help you gain access to that.
Thank you, Carol.
Back really quickly, I would say that it is important that we do those who have positions of power, whether it be an organization like NOMA or running a firm, or in Carol's case, doing both in the sense that she's the CEO of Shepley Bulfinch, but she's also the chair of the AI Large Firm Roundtable. And for those who missed that part in the intro, it represents the CEO group represents the 60 CEOs of the largest firms in North America, architecture firms. And I remember my first LFRT meeting at the end of 2018. And it was a little intimidating because this is kind of like the power structure that is architecture. And I remember sitting down, and Carol started the meeting in her role as chair. And she just asked that everyone go around the room, state their name, where they're from, which firm they represent, and what their firm is doing about diversity. And I was kind of blown away because I wasn't expecting that at all. And to, just to hear that this was an active part of the conversation within our profession was really powerful. And, certainly we have a long way to go, but to know that those conversations are happening at the highest levels, I think that's, that gives me a strong sense of hope. And, in terms of, Marcus's statement about fear versus indifference, I think it's becoming more part of our discussions now about how indifference is actually not going to be acceptable anymore. And so I think that's what a lot of our conversations now about how companies can't afford to be indifferent. When the murder of George Floyd happened, I think almost every company in America issued a statement, which means that they couldn't be indifferent because they had to say where they stood. So again, we have a long way to go, but I think that having these difficult conversations and holding people accountable and asking, where are you on these issues? I think this is a good start.
Well, and I think it's really important that we harness this time, right? So there are these moments when horrible things happen, but it wakes people up out of their indifference. And I really do believe that if you look at the protests and you look at what companies are doing, it feels different to me. Let's harness the difference. So if the door's a little more open to conversations about it, I think it's really taking it further and going into what are the policies? How do we understand it? I keep feeling like there's this tension between the health, safety, and welfare of our communities and capitalism. And we've got to own that there's a tension there. And we have to empower cities to do more. We have to acknowledge that architectural education is expensive. And so, I woke up this morning and thought, what could I share with this group? I want to share the books that I'm reading. Are you reading these books? And so the first book I wanted to hold up was When Ivory Towers Were Black. So Sharon Sutton documented how Max Bond made a difference at Columbia, but if you read through the lines, one of the key aspects was $1 million from the Ford Foundation during the race riots in the 60s to diversify the architecture department. So there's a connection between access and scholarships and funding that is real, and that we all need to do something about that and connect the dots on how do we create these pipelines into the profession for talented people that want to be here.
I want to give John an opportunity
Yeah.
to chime in. John, if you can maybe the last minute or two.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Great points, Carol, as always, and Kim. Also, good additional comments in there. You know, the question about who is accountable. We all are every day in everything we do in our practice. I have a small firm. One thing that I do is try to make sure that all consultants, all other resources that I use in my project are diverse. To make sure that they have opportunities. I don't have 16 people behind me working in my office, but I do have a group of 15, 16 individuals that are all my support entities. That those individuals are all very diverse. Being in the Southwest, obviously a large Hispanic Latino population, but also a very large indigenous population here. So, I mean, it's the always being able to make sure that you provide an opportunity to that next generation. In leadership in AIA, even in my local chapter, it's always the mantra that I have is that, yes, you are in charge of this committee, this task force, but you should, our program, but you should always be looking at bringing in and backfilling that with someone that could be the next leader of that task force, that group, and always looking for someone that is maybe not always available, or has not always had the opportunity of leadership, to bring them in and engage them to make sure that that next level of that next generation is there to lead the organization. It is our responsibility on a daily basis to make sure that we work to resolve the issues of racial, ethnic, and gender discrimination. It's imperative that we work hard and daily to resolve those issues and not manifest them.
Right. Thank you, John. Ziba.
Okay, moving to our next question. I want to first say that I feel that in many ways our world has changed both culturally and politically since the time of civil rights and equal rights movement. But in one big way, it has largely stayed the same, and that is the biased and negative perception of Blacks and other races and ethnicities that we encounter every day. Now, some people say that the problem is probably just a few bad apples. So with this, I'm going to first open the question to Kimberly. Do we understand the root of our respective biases?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that people are consciously aware of, where their biases come from, but I think there's a lot of, actually, I took this class in graduate school. It's called Exercising Leadership, the Politics of Change, and it was taught by a psychiatrist. And so that class really challenged us to think about where our loyalties lie. And our loyalties are tied to the households that we grew up in, the perspectives that our parents had, the kind of thinking about things that we've absorbed through not just our immediate family, but our more extended family, our communities, and even our ancestors. And so when we think about perhaps this isn't my particular story, but I've heard about this. Some people have grandparents who are racist, and so their Thanksgiving conversations contain some content that's like definitely inappropriate, but you can't but you can't necessarily just reject your grandparent in totality, because they're obviously a large part of the reason why you're there, and they loved you and they took care of you and things of that nature. And so I think it's important that we sort of take the best of what our past has given us, but also know what to reject. And so you can still love your racist grandfather, but reject the part of him that you don't want to take forward with you. I think that it's important that there's some people who they're not going to change no matter what, and you don't have to completely disregard everything about them. Like if they gave to the needy, but then they also had made racist statements. I think that you can borrow from what you want to take with you, but also withhold the things that you don't want to bring to your children and to your children's children. And so I think it's up to us to really dig deep and think about where our loyalties are, where we're, essentially how we're rooted, like the experiences that we've had, and, make the most of how we want to kind of carry forth, our message into the world that, that is about building bridges between different people, between different cultures, versus, trying to hold on to the different loyalties that maybe you grew up with, or maybe, even some of your friends might say things that, you think are inappropriate. I think that, I think it's a different conversation with a peer than it is with a parent or a grandparent, but, it's incumbent upon all of us to challenge, to challenge anyone who's saying things and who believes things that are inappropriate. And, you may still walk away with different opinions, and, so both parties still might walk away and, agree to disagree, but I think it's important that we all, speak up for what's right and what we know are the important things that others should be aware of as we're looking to essentially move towards racial healing. Because I remember I talked earlier about how every company in America put out a message post the murder of George Floyd. And one of those companies was 23andMe, like the ancestry, or, like you can look up your ethnic background or where you're from. And they're a group of scientists, right? And so their message was pretty short and to the point. It's just like, hey, we're scientists, and we know that humans are 99.5% the same. So what we're talking about, all these conversations, all these studies, all these things, it's like literally 0.5%, where we're different. And I think that we have to really focus on our collective humanity and how to build each other up and not tear each other down.
I want to give Carol also to give us.
Yeah, I sort of feel like this funny connection of in my career, I've worked on a lot of libraries, so I'm a book geek. So there's sort of so much history we were not taught. So our biases come from the segment of where we grew up and what we were taught in schools and what wasn't and wasn't in textbooks. Reed stamped from the beginning. This construct of race is a capitalist construct created around economies from Western Europe. And so if we don't learn where that history comes from, if we don't learn the craziness that was created around race, as Kim says, we're all 99.9%, the same. And so we had a dean's forum in the last couple months with students in architecture and deans in architecture and CEOs. And the students were incredibly outspoken and cogent about the Western European tradition in architecture. Why are we not, students who say, I was signed up for a course on world architecture and we learned about Egypt and then we learned about the Bauhaus. And like, what happened to the rest of the world? What happened to the rest of Africa? What happened to South America? What happened to Asia? And so I think we can all start to look with fresh eyes on the curriculums in our schools, what our kids are learning. The sort of construct for me is that I grew up in a certain era where my parents moved to a town where school integration was happening and we were going to be bused. And a couple of our neighbors moved because they did not want their children bused. AKA, they did not want their children integrated with the black kids on the other side of town. I was 5 years old. I felt a very visceral reaction to how wrong that was. So I think I was so lucky to be exposed to that at an early age that it created a construct that we talked about race growing up. And we talked about being bused, and we talked about, isn't it weird that black families live on one side of town and white families live on the other side of town? When we were children, we were just being inquisitive. But I feel so lucky to have been exposed to that. So I think, the responsibility of knowing whatever context you grew up in gave you messages. It framed you in some way. And as an adult, it's your responsibility to broaden your learning and learn about history and learn about the things that you weren't taught. And then, as Kim says, that I had a formative class in anthropology in school. And I was like, oh, wow, we're kind of wired for some stuff. We're sort of wired. And it reminded me of just coming up in our firm where most of the principals were white men, or 99% were white men. There was one white woman. Um, and they asked me which white man I was going to be like when I advanced in my career. And I was like, I think I'll be Carol. I don't think I'm going to be exactly like this white guy. And so I think white people have a lot of learning to do. There weren't as many stories in white families about examining racism if they didn't have an experience of living in a city or living in an urban environment or living in a diverse community. And so one of the things I keep evolving and have written about in a couple of magazines is have the conversation. Have the human conversation, and especially if something happens to you that doesn't sit right with you, whether it's at work or professionally or whatever environment, you're empowered to follow up on that conversation. You don't have to live with that whatever insensitive comment or racist or racial or sexist comment. You have the power to go back to that person and say, that conversation really left me uncomfortable. I was not happy with what you said. I just need you to know that that really affected me and I don't want that to happen again. And I don't know that it was intentional, but I need you to know that it wasn't okay. It wasn't appropriate. And one of my, sort of ritual things, especially as a woman in architecture, white men would say to me, so have you ever experienced sexism? And I was like, are you on the same planet that I live on? There is not a person of color or a woman in architecture or a woman on the planet that haven't experienced racism and sexism. And so I think we have to stop pretending it's a question. It's a reality. It's a reality that we want to shift and change. I think everyone attending this wants the world to improve and feel that they're all empowered to have an impact on that.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to move on to the next question. Earlier, someone brought up, I believe it was Marcus, the idea of fear, and so we'll give this group an opportunity to address that. In 2018, the Brookings Institute reported that the U.S. Census projects the United States to become minority white, still about 49.7% of the population, but becoming minority white in 2045, as described by the phrase, the browning of America. What will be the political, socioeconomic impact of the browning? We'll start with John, and then we'll allow Marcus to chime in.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen real quick. I'm hoping you see that. Kevin, you seen that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is a 2015 article written by William Fry. So 2015, a lot has changed since then. I mean, things have changed since then. But in 2015, they were looking at the idea that, the browning of America due to the rapid growth of Hispanics, Asians, and multiracial Americans. What's going to happen is the fact that they're looking at that in about 30 years, so now in 25 years, whites will no longer be the majority. So the idea of the browning of America, there are a number of articles, there are a number of items written about this. I think what ends up happening is we need to really look at the possibility of how do we, and I'm going to use the word take advantage of this, but we know that as far as a political opportunity, the browning of America. We're seeing it now in this recent campaign. We're looking at votes being looked at. We're looking at our Hispanic, our Latino, our indigenous individuals being looked at and being wooed for, you know, their political involvement. So I think what we need to do is look at the idea that we continue to see the social economic impact in our communities. As far as architecture is concerned, and I'll speak directly to the Latinx, the Hispanic, Latino groups that I'm aware of. There are groups in Chicago, Arquitectos out of Chicago, great group that does a lot of work within their community, within their schools, etc. There's also Latinos in architecture that run everywhere from East Coast to West Coast. Very active group in Texas as well as in California. So I think we all know and we all feel that there is this browning of America. But what are we going to do to take advantage of that? What are we going to do to bring that next generation into the profession of architecture? I know that growing up, I stumbled across architecture. I stumbled across architecture through a high school that I went to that was a vocational and technical high school. So I was introduced to architecture then. Never had known what an architect was. Never had that in my family, etc. Well, what are we going to do to bring that next generation up, expose them to the profession of architecture, and engage them in roles of leadership, not only within our firms, but opportunities to really take advantage of architecture and giving them the opportunities to be integral and a important part of our firms. So I think the idea of the browning of America, Kevin, is a reality. What are we going to do with it? What are we going to do to step up and really make an impact? And what are we going to do to make sure that that next generation benefits from our struggles, our goals that we've reached, to make their journey a little easier, a little better, and give them the opportunity to exceed as I have in this profession of architecture.
Thank you, John. Marcus, can you add anything to that?
Sure. Look, it's been said that politics is about who gets what, how much, and when. And I think that speaks to this unfortunate falsehood that there's a zero-sum game around resources. You can poll people, white people in certain communities, and they will be against policy that will benefit them in their particular social economic status because they believe it will help brown and black people. It also, I think, helps to segue into something I think we should all think about and maybe even discuss. And that is when it comes to the word accountability, because all this is great. And I think that being more aware of culture and discrimination and all that is wonderful. But to me, what success looks like is that whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, our firms, our organizations look like America, and not just on the lower level or the middle level, but on the senior level. And to me, and I don't know why it's controversial, but I'll throw it out there. To me, I think you have to assign numbers and metrics to it. I think saying we're going to try really hard and do the best we can and read a lot of books and really get in touch with our colleagues and make them feel better, all wonderful. But without the numbers assigned to it, without saying we commit to a certain percentage, whether it's in the people we do business with and the way that we recruit and the way that we advance people into senior positions, without that, I think that we're going to pretty much continue to spin our wheels. And it becomes controversial until you say, well, everything else in business is about numbers. You know, we're a publicly traded company and we have to give financial metrics every quarter. There's numbers associated with how I'm evaluated. There are numbers associated with how we're all evaluated. But the one area that you can't assign a number to, it's diversity and inclusion. And the falsehood in it is that it makes people who are in a comfortable position right now, who've always called the shots, feel like, oh no, they're going to infringe upon my power and my entitlement. And the reality is eventually they will learn that by bringing other people up, you expand the pie. And I always joke that, you know, you could be so worried about someone taking your position. Think about that phrase for a second. And the reality is these are people that you empower 5-10 years from now, you can work for them. And it's a change in a mindset that I think we all need to have. And I really impress upon folks to really have that hard conversation about how metrics and numbers can be integrated into a system of real accountability.
Thank you, Marcus. That was great. Ziba?
Thank you. So we're coming to our last question, and we're going to be a little quick on this one. Before I actually state the question, I want to share with you very interesting stats that I came across about a couple of days ago. 50% of Americans aged between 16 to 34 have attended Black Lives Matter. 90% of Gen Z Americans support the Black Lives Matter, while 40% of white Americans over 65 believe the country has done enough when it comes to ensuring Black Americans have equal rights. This is by Biz Insider and Stylist. And some trends that actually appropriate to mention is these experiences are pushing young people to demand meaningful brand engagement, expect companies to make supportive statements, and they think brands should amplify the voices of Black leaders. So with this, the next question, which is, what lessons can we learn, if any, from Generation Y and Z? And I'm going to direct that to Marcella first, and just give us your perspective from any angle.
Thank you. I think we should be aware that all the problems in our society is fundamentally a design problem. And millennials are probably the generation, due to probably social media and Instagram, that are very much design aware and the power of design. And I think as people training architecture and architects, we should learn from them and step up to the plate that architects is really the only profession that is trained to think as an interdisciplinary expert. Is the only profession that really looks at the entire built environment. And architects are trained to look at diverse perspectives. So we should learn from including the millenniums' perspective and understanding that our space matters. And virtual, analog, it affects our psychology, it affects our mental health. And architects and people training architecture need to embrace the new roles that architects are going to have to play. So that's my 2 cents.
Kimberly?
So as I think one of the early stage millennials, like in the early 80s, I would say on behalf of my entire generation, although, we're not a monolith, so we're not all the same. I think that, frankly, millennials, we didn't have to deal with the same baggage that our Gen X and baby boomer, colleagues have dealt with relative to race. And that's not to say that there are no issues within our generation. It's just, it's different. I think a lot of the overt racism and prejudice wasn't confronted as much as, as our older colleagues and family members. But that's not to say that, we don't have as much work to do. I think that we have a lot of work to do, because I think a lot of what we're dealing with now is that, just everyone is dealing with covert systems, dealing with systemic racism, and, trying to work within the power structures to make things right. So, I think that the big lesson that we probably learned from millennials is, I think we have less tension among our group. Again, there's some, and I've seen it to some extent, but I think that we generally are more harmonious with one another than I've seen from Gen X and the baby boomers. So that's my quick response, but happy to to further discuss that if others have different observations than that.
We are actually at our hour, and we wanted to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So, well,
Yes. So everyone that's in the room right now, we have 177 people. You're encouraged to either toggle the raise your hand button or type your question right into the. We have a few questions from Gabrielle. Do you want to ask your earlier question? And are you there, Gabrielle?
Will, you could read her question in chat.
She's on mute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought I unmuted and I was just running my mouth. Yeah, so my question was around sympathy versus empathy and how we must all figure out the difference when we're, trying to help or, whatever, our Black and Indigenous people of color in our organizations and just, so can any of you expand on that in your experiences? And Carol, you lead a large firm. So I'm just curious to expand that conversation because I'm finding that many leaders and many professionals do not understand the difference. And so they become more sympathetic instead of empathetic. And one implies they have no role and the other implies they accept their part in it and their responsibility to move this needle.
So I can quickly tell you that empathy is when you experience it because you have felt it before, or you can at least imagine what it felt for that person. So it's inside, versus sympathy, you're still removed. You still feel emotions for what that person is experiencing, but you're still removed from it. That's my personal understanding. So a lot of people, if they have never experienced racism, it's very hard for them to have empathy. But let's face it, everybody at some point in their life have been ridiculed or put down or killed their self-esteem. So I think even if you haven't experienced racism, you have experienced other kinds of oppression. And I think that's why everybody can have some empathy. So that's for me, empathy, you can walk on their shoes, and sympathy, you're outside their shoes.
Yeah, and I think this is Carol. I think that I was thinking of, we could also talk about the culture of criticism in architecture. I mean, there's some really horrible, belittling architectural reviews. And I think that sets our profession up in a very, sort of negative and insecure way. And so like if you're a white male that doesn't feel like you've moved from sympathy to empathy, think about some of the negative crits you had and how unfair they were and how that sort of belittling culture was considered okay, was even considered like we're striving for excellence, so we're going to be belittling to people. And I remember being exposed to reviews where unless we made someone cry, we weren't being hard enough on them. The world was going to be hard on them, and I think that created a lot of weird destructive behaviors and really hurt people. And I think that is a very similar thing that most architects at least have seen or heard of or experienced. And I kind of wanted to go to Gabrielle's empathy piece. If you're in a position of leadership and you see a problem, it's your responsibility to take care of it, to figure out how to improve upon it. Whether it's a problem with the building or it's a problem with the client or it's a problem in your firm, that's what leadership is. You have responsibility. And so beginning to explore that and understand that. And I think, the points on metrics and measuring are critical. And Kim can talk about, sort of improving the directory of Black architects, sort of how do we measure these things, improving directories that we can find minority firms. If you don't know the minority firms, then you have work to do. You have to go find those people. They exist. And so I think it's just taking some ownership. For me, empathy is like on the way to responsibility, taking more ownership for the influence that you can have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Nambi Gardner. Nambi, are you on the call?
I am on the call. Hi, everyone. I rattled off so many. Which one?
Your choice.
I want to go back to the idea that millennials are naturally more racially tolerant. I want to question this because there's sort of this assumption that young people are more progressive than their parents naturally on these issues, in my experience. And I have been sort of horrified by the indoctrination of millennials and Gen Z to the alt-right, radicalized, the incel movement. I just thought young people didn't do that, you know? and that's my bias. I'm a Zennial, you know, I'm like right on that year where it changes. So sort of old school and new school at the same time. And I just think what is horrifying is the idea that there are limited resources to go around, and we're all gonna have to fight for our children to have their share. And I think that's how this racism gets reborn in the next generation. It's economic forces and just the idea there's not enough room. And I think as architects, I've been trying to counsel my firm. I'm the Southwest Regional Race and Diversity Leader for Gensler. Big responsibility. You know, I'm trying to have real talk about this issue. And I just wanted to get other people's opinions. The idea that age somehow makes you more or less racist.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the challenge. And, you know, like I mentioned, you know, we're not all a monolith, and certainly we haven't arrived at the destination where we want to be. I do think, and I'll let other people to chime in here, but I do think that what we're experiencing now is far more overt than covert. Like I think earlier in our history, you know, things that I've heard about from, you know, older siblings and relatives and colleagues, they've been like very overt, like saying like super inappropriate things out loud. Whereas now we're dealing with something that's a little harder to navigate, but certainly we're not in the clear. So I wanted to clarify that. But others, please weigh in.
Yeah, Nambi, I think the youth of every generation, there's always been a portion who've been radicalized toward something that was not the norm. And I think for us, and maybe it was an over simplification, but for us, I think many of us have noticed that the marches and the protests for Black Lives Matter, I for one have been very impressed that that group has been more mixed than any other racial protest group I've ever seen in my life. And so I think it becomes easier for us to assume that this current generation is less racist. Not that everyone is less racist, but as a whole, this generation just appears to be a little more progressive than my generation and their parents. Now, of course, you're closer to that group, and so you probably know of instances that would absolutely appall me as well. But I think it's probably just an oversimplification on our part.
Yeah, Nambi, I want to say the same thing. You know, this is probably, you know, the stats that I pulled, it's really just, you know, few stats that it popped right away. And it doesn't mean that there are different stats that are competing as well. But like, you know, Kevin said, you know, very similar experience for me in terms of, you know, this is the time that it's been very inspiring for me, you know, seeing that how actually what's going on, it has become a movement. And for all the time that, you know, and, you know, I come from a different struggle. I come from like more of an Iranian background and, you know, an immigrant. And when I have seen how things gets silenced, and you know, you can never actually express, or you can never actually fight any of these racism and discrimination for all these years, and now actually you know, these past few months, and I believe that there are a lot that is in work than just just the new generation. I believe that pandemic has a lot to do with it, that, it has really uncovered many issues that, we wouldn't have a chance to really see it before. So, but I think at the same time, the power of the new generation that they just took the streets, it's it's very powerful, it's very moving, and we never had that before. We never had sort of like this kind of movement before. So I thought it was kind of interesting, but there's a lot more into it than just a few stats.
Ziba,
I understand. I didn't mean to put you guys on the defensive, really. I was just, you guys are like, no. I just really meant that it's complicated. We all know it's complicated. And,
Extremely.
and we're all sort of saying, maybe older generations, there's not a lot we can do to change hearts and minds. And so we have to look downstream, right, to our younger people in order to really affect this change. So that's all good. I was just trying to make the point, though, that you're right. We are going through a racial movement on top of a pandemic, on top of a recession, and on top of some serious climate change. The planet is fighting us back, straight up, and it's those four intersections that I'm trying to create Gensler's diversity and inclusion policy around. I would love to hire more Black people. We're furloughed because of the pandemic. I would love to fight climate change right now, but half the staff is migrating to escape hurricanes and fires. All of these four things I see are the same issue. And I can no longer address race and isolation from our work, from our, it's a spaghetti knot of complexity that some nights we just don't sleep. The leaders on our team, a couple of them are on this call. But I am so heartened, really, to hear the depth of conversation happening in forums like this. There is so much more real talk. I feel like the corporate facade has cracked forever now. And we're all just connecting in a way that's beautiful. And I try to remind myself of that so I don't spin out when I read news headlines, right? So thank you for letting me kind of say my piece.
Thank you so much, Nambi. That was very, very moving. We're going to move to Ronell's question, and then Josh, and then Craig. So we got 3 questions lined up. So Ronell, you're on the line.
Yes, good morning. Super excited to be here. Great conversation happening right now. My question is in regards to the disparity in funding, allocation, and access to funding for projects. One of my concerns is that when you look at history and what caused this problem, there has been like an immense amount of investment for eminent domain, for government projects, for slum clearance, to build the freeways, to build industry along Alameda and so on and so forth. And we know what the results have caused. What are the results? My issue is that when we're talking about addressing the results, my question to you all is, how do we reconcile the disparity in funding allocation in relation to like the heavy lifting that's happening to address racial equity or disparities in the built environment? And how do we hold government agencies and different developers and funders accountable to being more, to focus more on the racial equity outcomes in the built environment and make sure that there's equitable funding allocation to address these built environment things that at least reflect the same kind of investment that created the problem? I think there's a big disparity there. And then also really looking at how do we hold them accountable to not allowing big business to cut the line? When we're talking about COVID right now, Food access has always been an issue. Issues in the built environment has always been an issue. And there's a lot of frontline organizations, community-based organizations, minority-ran businesses that are addressing a lot of these issues, but do not have access to the funding that's being allocated, or do not have access, are easily able to get cut by big business. You know, we have the street vendors who've been fighting for 10 years to be able to sell food legally on the streets in LA, but they haven't got any permit approvals or whatever. But now you have big restaurants who are easily able to sell alcohol, you know, through these apps and so on and so forth. So permit expediting for big business and barriers created for small minority ran businesses. And so how do y'all reconcile that in the space in regards to funding allocation and access to funds?
So if I could just quickly respond. So in addition to architecture school for grad school, I went to get my Master of Public Administration. So, and people often ask, well, what does public administration have to do with architecture? And I think we can all agree that buildings are very much a part of the public realm. And so I wanted to better understand that. And so a couple of things come to mind, and I'm happy to kind of share the mic with others after I say my quick couple of pieces. But, you know, I think it's important that we find leaders that, you know, that are working in public service that can actually help to reallocate some of the resources that you mentioned. And if we can't find those leaders, we have to be those leaders. And I think that, you know, it's important that more and more architects and people, you know, with the kind of sensibilities to take these issues on, get involved with public life, whether it be serving on a committee or a commission or running for office. Which leads me to my next point is we have to vote and we have to be informed voters. I think that's so important because a lot of the issues that you're talking about are you know, tied to different people with different approaches to resource allocation. And then the last quick point I'll make is that, you know, there are examples of the, you know, intentionality around resource allocation. So for example, and not to say that anyone has done it completely perfectly just yet, but I remember in Chicago, Mayor Lori Lightfoot mentioned in a public statement this past February that she wants to end poverty within a generation in Chicago, and that's a very ambitious goal. But it's, you know, it's certainly a start to kind of getting to you know, to where the city needs to be. And specifically, she wants to focus on the south and west sides of Chicago, which for those who are unfamiliar, those are, you know, the neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. So I think, you know, a big part of the Invest Southwest initiative that's happening with Chicago right now is about literally investing resources in those particular communities and saying, hey, you know, all neighborhoods matter, but like these are the ones that matter right now in our effort to end poverty, which will have other impacts as you can imagine. So if you want more information, check out, you know, Chicago's Invest Southwest initiative, and I'm sure many other cities are doing similar things.
I think we have two more questions. So one from Josh. Josh, are you
Hey,
here?
yeah, quick plug. Even though it wasn't a question directed at me, we can have more resources if we defund the police. Just want to say that out. And now for my question. I'd like to discuss this idea of being in this together, because I actually disagree with that, because we are not in reality in this together, and that's how groups of people can remain indifferent, and they keep on being indifferent. So my question is, how can we get our colleagues who are indifferent to step up? That's it.
Josh, that's a great question. That was sort of the intent with this panel was to have everyone hold up a mirror to themselves, and no one will address an issue until they at least acknowledge first that there is a problem, and they also won't acknowledge that there's a problem if they don't see their role in the solution or their role in causing the problem. And so it's going to take each individual to hear what's going on, to hear what people are saying, and to acknowledge their part. We can't necessarily make everyone accept their part. I mean, there just are portions of the population who just refuse to accept that. But that doesn't mean that we don't continue to continue with our rally cry, and we continue to raise the issue until either that individual changes or the people around them change. But at some point, everyone's going to have to take their own responsibility for their part in the current situation, and then to address their individual change.
I also wanted to add there are a few resources I'd be happy to share with you. I had to educate a lot of people along the way, how architects really possess the power of creativity. I mean, many conversations that I'm the only one trained as an architect, as a woman, as a person of color. And I think that the role of an architect as a designer, the power of design is very, very powerful. And there's a lot of fabulous TED Talks, the Royal Society of the Arts and the Wire report, that the more you keep, think of yourself also as an educator, that constantly you have to be with empathy, even for people that, even if they don't know they are racist, many times they're not aware. I've met the most beautiful people and they're not even aware the way they behave is a way of oppression. Now that you have identified it, I'll be happy to share with you some resources through media, through TED Talks, I think we're living in interesting times that we can educate people the power of an architect and the inclusion that it can bring to a conversation through creativity.
Will, can we take one more question?
Yes, we have time for another question from Craig Atkinson from IBI.
Good morning. So as I sit here, and obviously our firm made a statement, and we have a task force, and we're working on this. And what really hit me with all the forums and all the things that were going on was how many concessions that I've made in my life to get where I am, and doing it subconsciously, right? I didn't do it. And I know Gabrielle and I have had this conversation, the things that I've done to make it to my position. What I'm really interested in is thoughts on, and then I have a young lady that works for me that said she was just happy to have someone that looked like me as her mentor and her boss, because she felt that she had, she was safe and she could just be her, right? So my thought is how do we, as we embark on these programs, we've got 60 offices around the world who are trying to come to grips with this, and and there aren't many that look like me. How do we create a culture that allows young people of color to just be them, right? To not worry about the fear of only having one chance at one bite at the apple. And I think a lot of us felt along the way, we could not make a mistake or we wouldn't get a second chance. So for me, that's what, as I look at young people and bringing young people into the profession, how do we create an environment where they can feel that they are allowed to make a mistake, that they can grow in the firm just as many of our white counterparts have several bites at the apple? Are there any thoughts on that? Because that to me is, we can get them in the profession, we can create pipeline, but unless we provide a real path for them to grow and succeed, they'll fall by the wayside.
So that's a great point. I'll quickly respond and open it back up. But I think it's important that, more young people of color in firms, coming up through firms, see people in leadership who look like them, and not just people who look like them, but also find mentors and people who don't look like them as well, and having advocates and sponsors everywhere along the way. Because, as humans, we all kind of, make missteps, and the extent to which you have someone who can advocate for you or help you, navigate or guide you through the process, that's really important. So that's my quick response to that, but great question.
Yeah, this is Carol. One other thought, or just something I've seen we've been doing at our firm, and encouraging all the large firms to do, is send your professional colleagues of color to NOMA. Fund them going to the conference. And this year it's a virtual conference, so it's very affordable. But I think if you don't find that person that looks like you in your firm, you might find it in the AIA chapter, or you might find it, and I think for my colleagues that, especially, as earlier in their career, folks basically said to me, thank you for sending me to someplace that I would see that there are so many architects that look like me. It's not just in my firm. And I think we have to help people connect to the variety of networks that can support them. And so I feel like that's at least something you actionable you can do tomorrow is say we support attendance at the NOMA conference just the way we support attendance at any AIA chapter conference, and that's something that organizationally we support. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is a big deal because I think in some, I would say majority owned firms, that conference doesn't seem as important all the time because people aren't advocating for it. So that's one thing that we're just trying to do is say that should be inclusive. And Kim referenced a conversation we had with our EDI task force when we first created it about 4 years ago, that white people didn't feel like they were supposed to go to NOMA. And I can't remember exactly whether it was Kurt Moody or Gabrielle who said, well, how are they going to meet the people that could hire them if you guys don't go to the conference? And so I think we're in this process of discovering relationships and connections that haven't been made in as deliberate a way, and that we now have to take care of them and make them more structural and make them more of a habit. And that's just one small baby idea, but I think it can make a difference to especially people who are in the early part of their career.
Thanks for the shout out, Carol. I'm going to put a link.
Absolutely, Kim.
Right now. There it is, everyone.
I want to also add, in terms of looking for leadership and leadership support, a lot of us, we always just, stay within our profession and our organizations. But another way is really open up, look at what's beyond architecture and, what are other professions that we can learn from. And making connections that way to different type of leaderships that actually can open up and connect us to actually to so many other possibilities that we never thought we could be connected to. So I would say that being more connected to many things that is going on, in terms of different organizations and different connections, not to stay closed in our own bubble and open up to what's going on beyond architecture as well.
I just wanted to add two minutes. There's actually a lot of companies that are doing retreats, and they're actually calling it inclusion exercises. And they're kind of interesting because they're almost architecture 101 exercises, but they're calling inclusion exercises. And I'll be happy to share with you some of those exercises that are interdisciplinary, and even inside a company, you can bring your accountants, your human resources, and they're basically about creating and making and doing. So I think a lot of organizations are looking into those innovations. They're calling it inclusion, but it's nothing else. It deals with racism and oppression and all those things that we suffer in multiple organizations.
Can I raise my hand? I can't find the button to raise my hand. So can I just raise a real hand? I want to share with you guys something that threw us for a loop when we began our diversity work at Gensler with renewed focus, which is we had a significant number of Black and African-American staff who were insulted to be asked to participate in our diversity and inclusion initiative. Because these are people who had based their whole career on being the best, competing, merit-based, promotion, and all of a sudden their careers have been racialized. And it is not fair that every Black person in a firm's like, so what do you think? So what do you think? How did you feel? It's not fair. And I find that this is only true in the Southwest region, that our East Coast regions that have more historically African-American communities embraced it. But here in California, I think there's something to the fact that we thought we were post-racial, maybe. And so we thought we didn't have to be overtly Black in our careers. And in this moment, we realize how wrong that thinking has been. I myself have never been a member of NOMA. I didn't want to be the Black people version of anything, you know? I wanted to go to Ivy League schools and go to work at the best firm despite my race. And now I just realized how stupid I was. And so, you know, it's not just about changing the hearts and minds of white people. It's changing the hearts and minds of Black people too. You know, me being right up there with my own biases kept me from advocating for my own people in my profession. And we're kind of reconciling with the professional shame about that, quite frankly, at Gensler at all levels of BIPOC leadership. We say BIPOC, you know, it seems like it's the most inclusive term of the day, but even the terminology changes. So just wanted to share that perspective, which is all of us need to change, you know, not just the white folks. Thanks.
Yeah, Nambi, this is Carol. I just had one thought, and it's such a great point to raise. But I was talking to a colleague who husband is from Gambia, and he went to school in London and eventually came to school in the United States. And she told the story about how he came home from his PhD program just dejected, and he said, I just hadn't been a color before. And I think this is a very American thing to make people colors and genders and sort of make that a definer as if you know someone. And so I'm hoping we can push through to that authenticity of we're all different. Every single person, we all have a story. But I think that that's a very American thing. And if you lived in other parts in the world or traveled in other parts in the world, race isn't as much of a definer in other parts of the world. And I think we could learn, like Ziba was saying, we can learn from other professions. We can learn from other parts of the world too. We can learn from other countries because we have to evolve that forward.
So,
okay, Will.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you so much. Kevin and Ziba, I really want to say thank you for moderating such an excellent discussion. We do need to move on to the next panel at 9:30, but I wanted to just say to Marcella and Carol, Kimberly, and Marcus, thank you so much, and John Padilla. That was a fantastic discussion. We're going to move on to our sponsor recognition next. But if we could do a real quick round of applause for everybody, we're going to unmute you all. And thank you so much. So I know everyone on the line, you might need a quick break.
Fantastic.
But we'll get started at 9:30.
Really wonderful.
Thank you, Will.
So I'd like to thank our annual sponsors once again. For me to work for the AIA Los Angeles, it's a gift, and I really appreciate the support that the architecture community provides the AIA chapter so that we can indeed offer programs like this. So the annual sponsors are up there on the screen right now. We have the most sincere appreciation for your support. And with Encompass, we're delighted to have, and the firms that sponsor Encompass, this is our 4th annual one, they've sponsored us almost every single time. So with that, Unibel, Rodemco, Westfield, thank you for being our presenting sponsor. Steinberg, Hart, the Penta Building Group, and ZGF, thank you for being the friends of Encompass. And for our participating sponsors, HKS, KFA, NAC Architecture, PCL Construction Services, Hanson LA, Bernard's, and Co Architects. With this, we're going to move on to Leslie and Christopher Locke. Leslie Sidnor and Christopher Locke, we're going to move on to your discussion next and get started right at 9:30. So if you're able to unmute yourself, Chris and Leslie, we look forward to having you join us.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Leslie Sidnor. I'm on the board of the AIA-LA, and I am co-chair of the AIA-LA SoCal-NOMA JEDI Committee. I want to thank you all for joining us on this conversation on urban resilience. We hope to share with you some projects that you can get involved in because we really want to take advantage of the energy that we've seen since this spring. Most, though not all of the people on the panel are actually not actively practicing architecture or architects because there are many ways to attack the things that are going on right now. So, we hope to share with you some projects that you can be inspired by to either join, because some people have some projects they want you to join with, or be inspired in your own work. And somewhere on here, Chris is around. Chris, introduce yourself. Is Chris here?
Can you all hear me?
There you are.
There we go. Hello, everybody. My name is Christopher Locke. I'm a designer at Egan Simon Architecture in Los Angeles, Playa del Rey area. Shout out to my team. And I'm also the co-founder of Design in Color, which is an organization that I co-founded with 3 of my partners. And we also have 3 other partners that we work with. And we are designers of culture is how we define ourselves, and building capacity and understanding for how we diversify and build new practices into architecture and organizing in communities. So if you're interested in potentially doing that in your practice and firm, please reach out. I think Leslie said it well about urban resilience, but one of the things I wanted to address is why urban resilience exists. And part of why it exists is the building of white supremacy that historically has been put into the United States of America. As a country, we've been built through imperialism and this understanding of Western European ideals into our spaces in which architecture has been complicit in building repeatedly year after year and decade after decade. That cycle must be unbuilt and unlearned so that we as a profession can create new possibilities and new futures. And W.E.B. Du Bois describes it really well. We have to practice a double consciousness. That double consciousness has historically been practiced by Black individuals in this country, not as a form of understanding, but instead of a form of survival. Double consciousness of my own Blackness in space as a Black man, but also the consciousness of understanding how my white colleagues or white people in space might also experience that to my detriment or violence, as we've seen over the last several years, whether your name is Jacob Blake or many others. So we're here as architects, as designers in space. We have to practice a spatial consciousness. And our white colleagues have to lead the way in understanding what it means to understand and develop a spatial consciousness to not only understand what privilege means, but power, place, and privilege, and how it plays a role in how we design and how we create mechanisms in space and process and design new spaces. So with that being said, and looking at the liberation of culture as it exists to urban resilience, our panelists today, as Leslie said, are a great group of folks, not just architects, but also people who just care about building the world through the lens of entrepreneurs and policymakers as it relates to food and as it relates to aesthetics of design. So we're super excited to present them. Leslie's gonna jump into that now, and put on your thinking caps, be ready to listen, put your privilege in a space in which you can learn, because we're excited to share this information with you all. Thank you.
Right on, Chris. The pandemic and the current civil unrest has shed a huge light on disparities, particularly the health of our urban centers and our communities of color. And these folks are definitely working in that space. I want to start with Lance Collins, and I'm going to share a slide that Lance is going to speak to introduce himself. Lance.
Good morning, everybody. Glad that you guys could all join us today. As Leslie mentioned, my name is Lance Collins. I'm a director, I'm a licensed architect, and I'm a director over at Partner Energy. We're a sustainability consulting firm. I'm also the president of the Southern California chapter of NOMA. And on top of that, I guest lecture at USC and a few other schools throughout the region as well too. So I kind of have my feet in a few different arenas all the time. And where I wanted to start with today is sort of, we're talking about resilient communities and healthy communities. And I want to start with something sort of obvious here. And the first and foremost thing on my mind today was really, if we want to talk about having healthy communities, we have to start with ending the killing of Black and brown people by police. It's really that simple as a sort of starting point. Now, obviously that's bigger than architecture, but that's the bottom line that I think all of us want to see, certainly based on the incidents of the recent few months, but going back to 50, 100 plus years, to say the least, that's a pattern that has occurred over and over and over again. So with that, in the previous panel discussion, the question was brought up about metrics and the importance of metrics in our industry in particular. So I thought I would share a few data points with you all to really discuss the importance of numbers. And then we're going to kind of carry that into the rest of our conversation going forward here. So SoCal NOMA has put together what we call the DEI Challenge, which is a voluntary program for any large firms, small firms, everybody to participate in, to start to track the metrics behind their performance of increasing the diversity, equity, inclusion in the AEC industry. Unfortunately, as we stand here today in 2020, there's still a lot of numbers about the success or lack thereof in our profession that we just don't have a good handle on the metrics. I talked with the AIA California board. I've had a number of conversations over the recent few months about just trying to get a handle on where we stand today. And a surprising fact, or maybe not surprising fact, came up. If you go to the California Architects Board and say, how many African-American licensed architects are there in the state of California? They don't know that number. That number is not publicly available. They'll tell you it's not something we track. We'd have to go look that up. Those sorts of statistics don't exist in a public fashion at this present moment in time. Now we guess, based on sort of, the Directory of African American Architects and, some other numbers, we guess there's about 21,000 licensed architects in the state of California, and maybe somewhere around 300 of those are African American. But, the state of California doesn't publish those numbers. So I thought I would lead with, here are some numbers that we do know. Number one, it's 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the police officer's knee was on the neck of George Floyd. Only 2% of licensed architects are African American. There were 2 armed citizens who murdered Ahmaud Arbery while jogging. There's only about 300 African American licensed architects in California. The 3 police officers who murdered Breonna Taylor while sleeping in her bed are still active and have not been arrested. There's only about 4 Black-owned architecture firms in Los Angeles, sort of not counting sole practitioners. It's been 6 years since the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, with all the riots and protests where we all said this is never going to happen again. We're going to all make this huge change. 6 years has passed since then. There's about 2,300 licensed Black architects in the entire United States. Now remember, I just said there's 21,000 licensed architects here in the state of California alone. Almost every year, 1,000 people are killed by the police. Only 493 licensed architects are African-American women in the entire United States. So we have a number of them on the call here today. If you know a few in your offices and from around your firm, you know a large percentage of those African-American women licensed architects. There were 7 shots in the back of Jacob Blake while walking towards his car with his kids inside. It's been 49 years since the founding of NOMA to address the lack of racial diversity in the architecture profession. And we're still having many of the same conversations that were had back in 1971. It's been 4 years since Colin Kaepernick took a knee to protest police brutality and was blackballed from the NFL. And 4 years ago, nobody understood what the importance of that was. Now today, we have people taking a knee all throughout the sports world and other professions because of the increased awareness. So numbers are really important. Metrics are really important in everything we do. That's how we measure success. Everything we talk about going forward, everybody's great statements of support, of sympathy and empathy are great, but we have to get to numbers that represent a true change in this industry in particular, but in the country as a whole. So with that, I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Lance. Our next person I want to introduce is Majora Carter. Majora, I think you have to unmute yourself.
There I go. Hi. Wow. Thank you so much for that, Lance. I am really glad I'm showing you this picture because I think, I don't know about y'all, but I need a little levity right now. Even though I know that all that you said is true, I am still so hopeful, and I did see hopefulness, you know, in that presentation because we're here and we're talking about resilience in a way that actually will support BIPOC communities and our country as a whole. So, so thank you again. So with that, my name is Majora Carter. I'm an urban revitalization strategy consultant and also a real estate developer, which is my primary work. And so I do what I do because I'm showing my age. I'm quoting Steve Martin in the Jerk, or sort of semi-quoting him. You know, I was born a poor Black child in the inner city, and in my heart, I will always be that. Born and raised in the South Bronx, New York City, literally as it was burning, also during the same time that hip hop came to come to the world. You're welcome. But it was an interesting time, you know, to be young, like very young at the time, which was when literally as my community, poster child for urban blight, you know, we were taught, you measure success by how far you get away from communities like this. You know, we definitely, you know, had, you know, these biases like ingrained with us. So I appreciate Nambi for talking about like how, you know, we weren't even expected to sort of advocate in many ways for our own community. We were actually told that we needed to measure success by how far we got away from them, especially like the brightest among us. So we were definitely all participants in brain drain in some way, shape, or form, even though, yes, there was a level of activism that was definitely working to rebuild the community. But the undercurrent amongst it all was that our communities were such that, yeah, we needed to make them a little better for the poor folks that lived here, but ultimately, really, we needed to get out if we could. And so, you know, I was led to believe that and used education to get myself out. You know, I started, you know, in the sustainability world. I started out as an environmental justice activist and was working on transforming, you know, first of all, like some of the solid waste management practices that our city actively used to continue to discriminate against my poor, predominantly Black and brown community of color here, and by citing facilities here. And so my work was to literally change like the way people looked at our land and have it be seen as something better. So we worked to transform dumps into what are now nationally award-winning parks. We started one of the country's very first green collar jobs training and placement systems that literally got folks, you know, that were in the actually coming out, you know, of jail, also, you know, had been on the public welfare system for a really long time, actually gainfully employed in green job industries. And we're really proud of all that. But it became really clear to me that it was about land. It was about real estate development, not just the environmental development piece, but also, you know, how, you know, who owned what, you know, how were people actually, you know, were we given opportunities or to just even see ourselves as people who supported the land in any real way? And so it became clear that real estate was literally everything. It determines how environmentally, socially, and economically things reflected back on us. Like, were we actual agents for their development, and did we benefit from them or not? And it became super clear that ultimately development was happening to us, but not necessarily for us. And that's why I decided, actually not that long ago, that real estate development was going to be the path that I wanted to take. And so, but first we had to really be clear and understand that the kind of communities that I was most passionate about working with are communities like mine in the South Bronx. You know, they are the places where, you know, people, whether between health issues and, you know, and low educational attainment, you know, high rates of poverty and unemployment being, you know, attached in some way, shape, or form to the justice system. And there's this understanding that both inside and outside the community, that there's a level of inequality that's there. Thus, why people want to measure success by how far they get away from the communities. But ultimately, when we asked people, and we asked a lot, especially here because, the South Bronx is not only my home, it's also my research and development lab where I feel like I can try stuff out. And so one of the things we did was ask people, what is it about, what are you looking for in the community that you think that you want to be in? And they said the same kind of things that you find in, more resilient communities, the kind of places that are considered livable by, that's what architects will call them. They wanted them walkable. They wanted them with, places where they could spend their money and feel good about spending it. They wanted places where they could hang out in and enjoy being in, housing that matched their incomes. There were aspirational people around them, some that they could enjoy. And it was so interesting that many of the things that they talked about were absolutely not in our community at all. For many things, from like coffee shops and bars and restaurants. We did have nice parks. I created one myself. So, but there was all those other places where you actually where you show that community is not just a place, but an activity. So we built those things. And so what you're looking at here is a picture of a coffee shop that I built, the very first one we've had in the South Bronx since I was in high school here in the 1970s. Actually, that building that they're sitting in right now was actually, it was cracked in, like it was one of the abandoned buildings where literally folks would, cracked holes in the walls and literally came in to shoot up. Now we don't see that anymore because what we have, is of the Boogie Down Grind Cafe, which is an homage to hip hop. And what we built there was this third space, neither work nor home, that people would gather to do, where creatives could gather, where like moms and older folks could gather just to hang out and to share their selves, with their neighbors, with their friends, where they could meet and figure out where jobs were, figure out to do creative things together. We use that space to host things like, credit repair workshops, musical events, open mics, all sorts of things like that, but creating the kind of stickiness within the community that actually allowed it to be, the kind of resilient and stable place because people could be looking out for each other because they got together. So building these kind of things was a really important thing for us to do. And so now of course, we're working on housing. We're trying to work on all sorts of other real estate developments, but ultimately this is what I could afford. Because as a Black female developer in New York City, guess what? It's hard finding capital. So we did this on our own and we're expanding that, but we're excited about it. But interestingly enough, and this is what, I kind of want to leave you with, was another thing that, that Nambi actually mentioned, actually Craig mentioned, is what Craig Atkinson mentioned, is that, we sometimes feel as though, oh no, sorry, it was Nambi, sorry, apologize. I took a lot of notes and so you have to forgive me if I'm mixing them up. But that our own biases about what our communities can be were on full view in this space because just a few months before we moved into this particular space, we were protested by a very sort of radical group within the social justice industrial complex here in New York City, because they felt as though since there was a coffee shop, it must have been done by somebody from outside the community who didn't have any real roots in it. Even though it was clear, it was me and my family's been in this neighborhood for 3 generations. And there was big signs, calling me a sellout and, F Majora Carter and all sorts of stuff like that. But what was the most ironic thing was that inside we were hosting a workshop that was specifically to provide low-income homeowners in our community, which most of them are low income, and also people who were starting businesses with very low cost or 0% interest loans. So the irony that there was this tension between people feeling as though like if you do anything like that, like the development somehow in our communities, that it's somehow inauthentic and it can't possibly be from this community, versus the reality that we were advocating, many of us were advocating for our own community. But that development is that level of understanding of how we do that is also something that we still have to fight over in terms of like creating different opportunities within our own communities to support ourselves. So we're looking, to the design community as well as being partners, but we recognize also that we've got work to do internally as well. So I want to leave you there with that.
Thank you. I next want to introduce, got two more, Ron L Hampton.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Ron L Hampton. I'm an urban sustainability planner that aims to make a material change in the built system that improves the outcomes of academics, economics, and health. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick. A little bit about me. I'm a first-generation college student from San Diego, a former foster child. And throughout my life, I faced barriers in the built systemic and natural environment that impacted academics, economics, and health for myself and my family. At a very young age, I started doing community advocacy because of the community-based organizations in my neighborhood. And one of the things that I realized very early is that a lot of the resources that community-based organizations brought to the community were not sustainable because community-based organizations kind of have funding challenges. What I experienced, organizations like Palaver Reclaim Hope, and there was another one. But yeah, these community-based organizations really provided computer literacy support, sex education support. There was an organization they had called Save Ourselves, which addressed like, well, I graduated from Cal State Dominguez Hills with my bachelor's in negotiation conflict resolution, went on to get my master's in urban sustainability. Hopefully you all can hear me. It's saying my internet is unstable, but I'll keep going. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I currently am pursuing an architectural drafting and design associates at Long Beach City College, and I'm certified in CAD. I do have a master's in urban sustainability, and I went back to school to really figure out how to represent the concepts of sustainability within design and the built environment. Currently, again, my goal is to make a material change in a built systemic and natural environment that improves academics, economics, and health. I currently do that as a policy manager with the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, where I lead the policy development work for our working group initiatives. We are focusing on food waste, urban ag, as well as the good food economy. And I also am the founder of Growing Greatness that really is rooted in connecting the dots with small to mid-sized level organizations around racial equity and economic inclusion. So we facilitate diversity trainings and implicit bias trainings to help bridge the gap, especially for organizations that aim to help impacted communities, make sure that they're also helping their impacted employees. When we're talking about the built systemic and natural environment, I look at the built environment like brick and mortar creation. What is being developed in our communities? How many parks do we have? How many stores do we have? Do we have libraries? Things of that nature. Systemic environment is really around policy. How does policy impact the outcomes people are experiencing? Who is benefiting from the policy implementation? And then also the natural environment is really green space and land use. When we're talking about our natural wetlands, our coastal vegetation and things of that nature, are we replenishing those areas? Are we extracting from those areas? When we're talking about urban communities, there's a lot of urban heat islands. That's reflective of a loss of a lot of vegetation and green space. Many of our urban areas do not have the overhead canopies that they need. So that is really speaking to the natural environment. So bringing to like the frameworks, right? Because I'm a systems thinker and my whole thing is how do we make this work? How do we really have these real conversations that result into outcomes that address the disparities that we oftentimes talk about? Currently, I facilitate a lot of these conversations through framework. And I think when we use frameworks, it really helps orient your group that you're talking to, facilitate the conversation, and really help manage values and around collective impact. So one of the things that I'm really focused on is really making sure that impacted demographics are leading these conversations that are being facilitated around policy development and brick and mortar development. So with this framework, it's really making sure that this can be used in any type of situation, whether it be inside an organization developing policy around racial equity, or within a community-based organization that really wants to address impacted people's challenges around, let's say, food waste, urban ag, good food economy. So again, you want to make sure that the conversation is really being led by impacted people, and that they decide what policy implementation strategies are going to be leveraged to move the conversation forward. And a lot of this can be going into more detail. This is just an overview, but I just wanted to introduce this framework around policy development structure and introduce a framework that has been, that I've leveraged to facilitate these conversations in some of the spaces that I'm in. Moving on to internal policies and systems change. In regards to the organizational training and evaluation around implicit bias training and consultation, analysis to ID focus areas, many community-based organizations, small to mid-level corporations really have a big area of opportunity in being authentic. I'm currently reading a book called The Business Secrets of the Trappist Monks, and it talks about business authenticity. And one of the things that is true is that I really feel a lot of times we have these values that we say are ours. We say that we're not racist. We say that we're committed to racial equity. We say that we're committed to economic inclusion. But what does that actually look like in practice? And I think oftentimes organizations have a challenge, and we talked about this in our last committee, the last conversation, is they have that challenge with being authentic with what they say they want or what they say they represent versus how that actually looks like in practice. So if an organization is saying that they're committed to racial equity, how does that reflect in your board diversity? How does that reflect in your leadership development opportunities for your employees? And how does that reflect if we take a deep dive into equal pay and right to work for your employees? These are things that can be assessed, looked at, and identified. And so by doing so, you can use an analysis to make policy implementation suggestions to address areas of opportunities. And this is really about system change outcome to understand the impact that you're actually having with the infrastructures that exist within an organization, and assessing the authenticity in regards to how it looks in practice. When we're talking about frameworks, it's really important to have like road mapping. I think for me, one of the biggest things that has been very helpful, especially when centering impacted people in the conversation, is getting them to share their stories. I think oftentimes we do not realize how much our lived experiences really are the answers and reflect the answers that a lot of times people who are trying to facilitate these conversations from outside of our community are not really tapped into. They do not know the lived experiences. They do not know the suggestions that impacted people have in regards to addressing the solutions. So this framework is something that I modeled after the narrative-based strategy approach that I learned in grad school. But this framework is a way to move the community organizing through this conversation. So our narratives are used to identify barriers, opportunities in the existing system, to investigate challenges, successes presented in target policy area, to develop solutions that connect the dots between barriers and opportunities. And then ultimately our goal is to inform decision makers through policy proposals, structural changes, and programmatic recommendations. And then our goal would be to evaluate that. A lot of times once a policy passed, a lot of times people think, oh yeah, we did our job. But we really need to do the hard work after that, which is really making sure that the policy is implemented efficiently and that it actually achieves the goals that were set out in regards to the outcomes that it achieves. So that requires an evaluation of the results and impacts, and then really tapping back into the stories. What are people experiencing? This to the right, you see this collected story bank is a narrative atlas. I think it's really important because a lot of times we have these conversations are not new. I've coined this term in some of these spaces that I've been in where these are old conversations with new names oftentimes. And oftentimes we have our local government agencies moving the goalposts to conversations that have been going on for decades. Specifically in food waste, food security is a big issue that has been exacerbated by COVID. So this story bank or a narrative atlas allows us to have a space where these stories can live, connected to the people impacted by them. And this will hold a lot of these accountability factors when we're talking about moving the goalposts. We can say, no, actually, these stories are collected. We know who's being impacted, and we have these solutions in regards to the issues that are on the table right now, and we do not need to move the goalposts from this. When we're talking about understanding our stories, the legislative canvas is really the way that we pull kind of the different components that allow us to move a policy goal forward. But this canvas is a way for us to use our stories to do so. So in our narratives, from our lived experiences, we can identify the challenges. We can identify the systems that impacted or created those challenges, whether they be an existing system or a potential policy window for a legislative target that can be used to address it. Through our experiences, we also can identify what the disconnect is and how to connect the dots around solutions. Our stories also allow us to identify who the target demographic is. For example, who will be most impacted by the policy win or the policy loss? Who are the adversaries? Who are the proponents that are pushing towards not getting the policy passed? And who are the champions? Who are the ones that have been staunch supporters of it, who've been pushing this for a very long time? Also, when we're talking about our narratives are really powerful for us to identify conflicts, characters, so on and so forth, systems. And then also, I think what's really important, this goes back to authenticity, is what values are driving our narratives, what values are driving our policies and our decisions. And I think that the value component is one way that we can hold corporations, businesses, and even ourselves individually accountable. Because one of the things I noticed is that a lot of times when we talk about our values, we then have to make sure our values are represented in our actions. So when we hold people accountable to the values that they say or that they express, we have to be able to say, oh, how does your values reflect in your policy? How does your values respect in the diversity that you have and things of that nature? The values is what allows us to hold individuals and organizations accountable. I do want to just touch on briefly the brick and mortar component, because this is more of the built environment piece. And I think this is about connecting the dots in regards to partnerships. Like I said, I work with Los Angeles Food Policy Council, and we do brick and mortar transformation projects in the built environment. One of the great things about our projects is that we work with existing infrastructure. We work with businesses, store owners, and spaces that already exist in the communities. And a lot of these communities are experiencing food apartheid. So our goal is to make sure that all Los Angelinos can go 0.5 miles from their home and access fresh produce. In regards to the way that we do that is work through technical assistance and transformation projects with our store partners that we participate with. Our transformation projects require a very large partnership in regards to architect firms. I mentioned Gensler is one of our former partners, but we need consistent partnerships throughout our projects every year so that the consistency of our outcomes and the impact that it has on our store owners are met. I think that this is a great opportunity for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Challenge. LAFPC is really changing the built environment and really doing it in a very sustainable way, and also doing it in a way that affects, in a positive way, impacted people. So I'll go ahead and end it right there. I know we'll be talking about a lot as the conversation continues, but that's just a glimpse on some of the work that I do and how it impacts the built systemic and natural environment.
Thanks, Ronell. You gave us so much to think about, which will be great as we toss to the audience. But we have our last speaker, Damar Matthews. Please jump in, Damar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Damar. I am the founder and principal of a small design studio, Off Top Design. And my work is really focused. I'll share my screen for a quick second. My work is really focused on improving the built environment in Black neighborhoods specifically. Coming into my final year of my Master's of Architecture degree, I was just realizing that I had only been taught how to design for other communities and how to design based off of other people's aesthetics. And I already knew that I was interested in focused on Black environments, which I had never been shown architecture in a Black neighborhood, or I was never shown a Black architect. So I didn't, I started to kind of have to do this dive by myself of figuring out, who was speaking about this, who were asking these same questions before. So now I really kind of just go into a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, which consists of a ADU that's being built in Watts. And really, I've focused on Black LA, which is South LA. And you look at kind of the displacement. First, you have redlining that kind of got us into these specific areas. And now the displacement is kind of taking us out of these areas that we're very much used to or, have called home. Watts, for instance, was almost 90% Black 30 years ago, and today it's less than 30% Black. So once Black people leave these areas, where does the history go? The built environment isn't speaking to us in terms of our culture or aesthetics that reflect our culture. So I was interested in that, and I had to analyze the built environment first, and I'll only run you through 2 or 3 of these slides really quick. When you look at the language of a building like this, where the fence is pointing inwards, where it's as if the built environment is kind of trapping the people in. And I read a book by Rashad Shabazz titled Spatializing Blackness. And in the book, he said the children here are surrounded by wire mesh and fencing that makes their living environment resemble the catwalks of a prison. The abundance of security measures in these Black neighborhoods and housing projects specifically, such as policing, 24/7 video surveillance, perimeter patrols, apartment sweeps, etc. These factors of the built environment affect Black kids' mental. And if you are living in an area that resembles a prison, how much more likely are you to go to a prison? How much, is it an easier adjustment for somebody coming from an area that has these common materials than someone coming from, a suburb? And so I was interested in unearthing a Black aesthetic that could possibly speak to raising the perception of Black people in America, because we have a really kind of a challenge, not even kind of, we have a really tough challenge facing some sort of negative perception through no fault of our own. But architecture has a role in this negative perception. And when you look at images like this, these are all in Watts where my site is. The background, say this instance on this image on the left, you have a man who's standing with his child, which should be a beautiful thing. And the architecture should speak to his culture, but it's actually making it just look like a prison in the background. It kind of looks like this is a visitation or something. So I was really interested in how to explore Black aesthetics to be able to create a pure architectural language, which is a conversation that a lot of us have been in or have tried to raise. And so I really just kind of take you through, I was really interested in architecture's role in perception and identity. So we look at kind of factors of what makes a person different, and looking at values, traditions, experience. Everybody when you come to America kind of brought these architectural traditions that they were able to kind of bring here. So now there's buildings in the built environment that will reflect their culture, but that's not really true for Black Americans. I mean, sure, you do have some buildings, but in terms of housing, it's definitely a rarity that you're going to see something as a Black person that speaks to your culture. And I think that that's important, for one, for designing against displacement and gentrification, but two, for allowing pride in the built environment and allowing a sort of cultural permanent imprint on the built environment. So this is the house that we're working on getting funded right now. This is actually an artist residency. And there's a secondary house on the lot as well. We have about a 1/4 acre and it is directly next to the Watts Towers. And so as soon as you get off of the site, you're onto my site. And so the 2 houses on the property are going to be used as artist residencies. This one is the new construction that is my design for the last year. It's still kind of ongoing in collaborations with the community. But along with this artist residency, we're trying to figure out how does a Black aesthetic address community? And I think that it had to address community. So we were wondering, okay, what are the resources that this community needs specifically? And it's a horrible food desert, as Ronell was speaking to before. Watts has 1 grocery store and it's a food for less. And food for less is like they're not great grocery stores in terms of the produce that's available to you. So if you don't have a car in Watts, you got to walk at least a mile basically from the center of the city to get to that food for less. And so how do we bring things like this? How do we bring health, which in terms of produce, wellness, art, and education to one site? And so we got very fortunate. We have almost a 300-foot fence line. And along this fence line, we are trying to give all the resources that we can. So really it's kind of divided up into 4 sections. The first section is fruits, vegetables, and spices. And we have about 15 growing now up along our fence line, and we're growing another about 15 to 20. All these fruits and vegetables will be able to be taken off of the fence line for free by the community. Kids, some of the homeless people who live right outside of the towers, adults, just, everybody can kind of come and just take these things off of the line. As well as allowing us to have programming that teaches the community how to grow their own produce. And hopefully we can kind of continue this idea of this sort of co-op where people kind of grow what they need for themselves and possibly grow what the community might want for the other side, and everybody can kind of feed themselves and stop kind of waiting for the government or a program to come in and help you and figure out this thing on our own. Hopefully the next section of the framing is a free outdoor library that we've already began collecting books for. This is, again, the community is at full, they have full ability to come and take and sit whenever they want here and grab anything they want. And the last section of the framing are 2 kind of art framing sections. And the first half is for the community, hopefully kids, to be able to come and paint or draw or do whatever they want on this wall to show expression and be able to have a real place to exhibit their work and show their work outside. It is outside, but this is an early design for this. We're kind of a lot past this. I'm just waiting to show the new stuff. But the last part of the framing is for the artists who will be in residence there quarterly, to have quarterly exhibitions along this wall. So we're speaking to Black Watts specifically, where outside of these towers, you had Noah Purifoy, John Otteridge, these artists who made Watts Towers what it was and had a large hand in Black arts and creativity and education here. And we're trying to pay homage to that through this site and through this building. So we are still accepting donors and partnerships with this project. It's you can feel free to check it out on my website, and I'll put that in the link. But yeah, that's most of the work that I'm kind of doing personally in terms of unearthing a Black aesthetic and trying to provide resources for Black community.
Thank you, Damar. Very great work, Majora, Ronell, and Lance. So as you all can see, we have a great group of minds, of Black minds who are not only looking to impact and create change, but are looking to unearth new possibilities in an Afrofuturistic sense and sensibility. So the beauty of that in the mind and the culture of who we are as people has to be celebrated, whether it's architecture, art, design, music, or the braiding of hair. So with that being said, I want to open up the floor to a question to the group, and what we'll be doing over the next, we're running a little bit behind time, so what we'll be doing for the rest of this panel is if you have any questions for the panelists, and again, our goal is to find opportunities for you all to engage in the work, in similar work that the panelists and speakers are engaging with right now. So if you have any questions to move into that relate to Damar, Majora, Ronell, or Lance, please certainly throw them into the Q&A. But I'm going to start us off with the first question, which is trying to unpack the sensibilities of resilient communities. So to all my panelists, in your line of work, please describe the key factors and elements that define resilient communities and resilient practices. And what are the challenges and opportunities that come with this? I'm going to first throw it to Lance, since he was the last first person to speak, and then we'll and everybody else can just kind of jump in and weave in as they feel.
Thanks, Chris. So, you know, as I kind of led with the beginning, sort of my sort of primary day job is in the sustainability consulting world and design, sort of focused in that sphere. And so resiliency, sort of in the sort of most traditional definition, is really about the environment's impact on a building and the building's impact on the environment. And so we're really good at sort of understanding climate change, you know, what is sea level rise going to do, and preparing for hurricanes and all those sorts of things. But I think as an industry, we're still, you know, weak, I'll just say, on understanding the building's impact on a community. And in particular, as we get into sort of, you know, bridging between all the gaps between racial justice, social equity, sustainability, all these different things, we need to really take a closer look and put more effort into understanding the building's impact on the community. You know, the thing that fascinated me the most about the profession of architecture as a kid growing up is the power of architecture to change communities and to impact people's lives. And so, you know, we need to be sort of more understanding, and I think it was said sort of in the first panel about sort of accountability. As architects, we need to be more accountable for the resiliency of our buildings and how they impact the surrounding environments that they exist within. You know, just because, you know, the design brief gives us a particular program and says you need to have X number of square feet and so on and so forth. And just because the site plan has a property line around it doesn't mean the building impact stops at that property line. So we need to understand, if we're going to be designing and building in a more resilient manner, how we are impacting our communities, both in a physical form, but also in the people that live within those communities as well.
Thank you, Lance. Anyone else feel free to jump in?
Well, I mean, sustainability to me is definitely considerate of the natural environment as well as the individual. I think that those two things are the ones that I focused on when I was in grad school, is really seeing how extractive practices of extractive economic practices impact the individual and impact the environment. So one of the things that happens, especially in low income communities of color, is there's a lot of health disparities as a result of how industry impacts the environment. There's a lot of air quality issues, things of that nature that come into place. And the work that I do now, it's really about helping the most impacted people understand their role in addressing some of these challenges as a result of their lived experiences and the sense of urgency that it has on their lives. The way that I feel we can address sustainability in, you know, the way that I address it in my field is really centering the impacted people as leading the conversation, making sure that we create platforms for them to suggest solutions, to lead conversations with the government officials and decision makers that reflect their lived experiences, you know. And a lot of times people don't connect the fact that everyone in their community, or a high amount of people in their community, have asthma, to the fact that there's a freeway next to their house. They don't connect their behavior issues to the toxic air and the behavior consequences, right? So those kind of connections to how the natural environment, when we're talking about our groundwater and how we're accessing groundwater, and how, you know, a lot of our water is coming from like the Colorado River, and from up north versus us being able to access the groundwater that we have locally because of how we've allowed industry to pollute it, right? Cities like Watts and Compton have groundwater reserves, but they can't use them because they're polluted. So when we're talking about extractive wealth, extractive economic practices, and the impact it has on the individual's health, as well as the way that the individual can act with the natural environment.
I'd also probably say that resilient, I mean, I guess it kind of means a few different things for a community. On one hand, it has to, I mean, it almost goes hand in hand with like sustainable, I guess. But when I think of Black communities specifically, which is where my work is focused, what it takes to be sustainable means kind of fighting or being able to stay where you are is kind of one big thing, to not be displaced, to not be gentrified, to be able to have a stronghold in your community that maybe does continue, like Majora said, she has 3 generations in South Bronx. That's kind of dying away in cities like Compton and South Central and Watts. You're going either 60 miles east or you're going 60 miles north. And what happens there, you know, this is beyond needing produce and needing regular kind of everyday or basic essentials to live a healthy life or to live a somewhat sustainable life. So I think it's kind of, it's a tough answer, or it's a tough question for Black communities specifically.
I actually love that question because I feel like people in communities that are not considered particularly resilient right now want the same things that everybody else wants. You know, they want to know that their community is safe, healthy, fine, and super fun. You know, they want to be able to economically and socially take care of the people around them, and that they have a good time doing it. I mean, that's really what everybody wants, that resilience. So that means walkable, livable. You guys all got the lingo. But what I think is really important here is that what resilience is that, you know, people, because we're looking nationwide, not just in my neighborhood, not just in Compton, everywhere. We have been looking traditionally for decades after Fair Housing, you know, Act made it so that we could economically, that financial industries could economically discriminate against Black communities and later other communities of color, you know, legally through redlining and crappy ways that we do lending practices. But we're still dealing with that to this day. Predatory speculators know full well the value in communities like ours. They know the value. Unfortunately, many of us don't know the value. So we will sell early and cheap. Around the country, we've noticed, even since the 2008 recession, that there's been so many of us who have sold our property. If we know in America that holding onto property is one way to create generational wealth, resilient wealth for our families, and yet we've lost a lot since then. And there's not been any, whether philanthropic and certainly not municipal and certainly not federal from what I've seen, too many opportunities for people to support folks to keep their land. And so that we see the need to, and the efficacy of reinvesting, you know, not just economically, but socially, spiritually, you know, within our own community to support future generations in our own community. But the first problem that we have is many of us not thinking that there's value within our own communities. And that's one of the reasons why we often leave for greener pastures.
And I wanted to just add on to Majora what you're saying, and Damar what you're saying. And, you know, I think we sort of, there's a double usage of the word sustainable. So I think probably the majority of us are familiar with sustainable as far as sort of environmental responsibility and climate change and energy efficiency, all those sorts of things. But in particular, when it comes to sort of building communities, we're talking about sustainable as being long lasting, carrying that identity to have longevity, like you said, whether it's for land ownership or the aesthetics, all those different things. And I think, unfortunately, sort of you know, history has taught us that all of us, in particular in the Black and Brown communities, have been preconditioned to aspire to the same things we see occurring in other communities. Hey, you know, earlier in my career when I did a lot of urban design work and lots of community stakeholder meetings, you ask people what they want. It's like, hey, we want the Applebee's in our neighborhood, and we want, you know, the Spanish tile roof in our neighborhood on our homes, and we want this and we want that, because that's what they see as the sort of things to aspire to that, you know, are provided to other communities, without understanding the value of the land that they have in certain cases, or certainly including sort of a stronger cultural identity in their own neighborhoods and the communities to support, you know, healthier development of kids and all those sorts of things. So when you have the opportunities, when there is economic disinvestment in communities, and it's, hey, I'm going to move to, you know, the Inland Empire, I'm going to move to Palmdale, I'm going to move to certain areas, because those areas are already sort of pre-populated with the things that we've been taught to aspire to, instead of figuring out a way to carve out the identity within our own communities. So it's all of us, I think, have been sort of subject to that, you know, through lots of preconditioning that we still need to sort of get over.
Yes.
Dahlia Goldchat had a question for Damar. Dahlia, do you want to ask that question?
Hi, Damar. I was just wondering if you have any concerns about gentrification, given that when these changes are made, there's always this concern of gentrification. It sounds like it's already happening.
Yeah, I think that gentrification kind of happens differently than a lot of us think it happens. You know, and so number one, and I think maybe that's just kind of a conversation for later. So what I'll answer to this specifically, I'll say, of course I thought about it initially, but number one, it's a home that this project is taking place at. It happens to be a larger property size or, you know, land size, but in terms of worrying about gentrification, no, I'm not worried about it. One, because we have a Black homeowner who is not giving up this land, and she's had this land in her family for generations, and what she kind of wants and sees for this is the same thing that I do. I kind of brought the idea of unearthing a Black aesthetic in this Black architectural language, and she had a lot to do with the idea of community symmetry in this. So one, the community has their hands in it before anything goes. That's why it's kind of been a very slow going process ever since COVID. But I hope that I'd be fine if it gentrifies it without displacing the Black people. So if it's just that the Black people barely ever get to take part in the positives that happens from the gentrification. We just need to, go ahead, Majora.
I'm sorry, but I struggle with this question. So it's, you know, I get it all the time, literally all the time, you know, as Black as I am, as local as I am, it's like, you know, the question, you know, comes down to like, you know, are you worried about making your neighborhood so nice that, you know, it's not for the people that are there? Who says we don't like nice things? Number one. Right. Number one, let's get that. We love nice things. Okay, so let's get that over and done with. And then the other piece about gentrification, part of it is simply the result, you know, of population changes. We're talking about the reurbanization of America and the fact that we're not actually, you know, just as a cultural policy-wise, the laws of supply and demand, we are not building, you know, enough of different types of economically affordable places for people to live. And we're certainly not thinking more about mixed income communities as well. So the fact is that you've got now millennials and baby boomers that are looking for the same type of communities, and developers are building to them. And so, yeah, I think it does actually, you know, behoove people on this call, you know, and folks who care about this stuff to be thinking about how are we encouraging, you know, and using our talents, in particular people like me as developers, to actually build the kind of communities where we actually are building enough to increase the supply, you know, take care to make sure that we are creating and supporting the kind of cultural vernacular and aesthetic within the design that also meets the needs of the folks that are already there, as well as the ones that are going to come. because they are coming. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But have we developed, you know, the right, I mean, I think it's you know, poverty in poor neighborhoods is just considered, it's almost a cultural attribute by policymakers in particular. And, you know, so if we're not actually saying that, no, it's not an attribute within our communities, it's really about how do we design, you know, and support, you know, the needs and the aspirations of everyone within our community. So I think it's something that we have to acknowledge that almost never happens in real estate development when it comes to communities like the ones I think we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I think that this, when we have this idea of it's like Black neighborhoods can only stay Black neighborhoods if the buildings don't get updated.
I know.
It's like we're looking for amenities too. And I'm looking to move now, and you know, I'm really specific and staying in like South LA, but I can't find the things that I need in the building. So if I don't have like a fitness center or places to get food locally, then I can't, you know, then I have to go outside of the Black area to get that. And we have to bring that into the Black neighborhoods and allow Black people to utilize or to be the ones to benefit from that.
You're right.
Well, there's other interesting thing that's happening though. For example, there's the project that's going on at Crenshaw and Slauson, and there's a lot Destination Crenshaw. And there's a lot of you know, interest around that. There's conversations about the gentrification of that area. We're already seeing it literally, and I saw this about 8 months ago. 3 blocks from where Nipsey Hussle was murdered, a house went on sale about a month after he died, and that house, which is like at the time was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, went on sale for north of $500,000. So Damar, if you want to move there, I mean, you know, who's moving? That's part of the problem, is that, and you know, it speaks to what Majora's talking about, is, you know, the developers are coming in and they're looking at these things that, like, you know, oh, it's getting nice now. Oh, the prices of things are going up. And it's not just that we're moving out, but if you want to move in, there's just a certain echelon of us that can move into that neighborhood now. And the people who are there, they're going to find it hard to stay.
Well, I think a component about this is we talked about this a little bit, is affordable housing for retail and residential. Affordable, because a lot of tenants are renters. So when we're talking about gentrification and who gets pushed out, it's oftentimes the renters that are getting pushed out. And so with that being said, there's a policy component to this that creates this kind of tension of impeding gentrification or impeding development because of the policy that supports the displacement of people when new developments come up. So there's this reality that we have to have policy that backs new developments, that have like contingencies on existing tenants to ensure that there's some component that allows them to be resilient when these new developments are happening. I think also when we're talking about sustainability, I think we also need to be mindful of new developments versus maintaining the current infrastructure, or building out the current infrastructure, because there's a lot of dilapidated buildings that need support right now, right? And there's tenants that need those buildings built without it meaning that they're gonna be displaced or gentrified, or, you know, have to pay $1,000 more in rent. So there's this disparity of, it's not that impacted people believe that they don't want good things, but it's when good things do come, they're being displaced. That is happening. So we need to have policy that supports resiliency when new developments or renovations happen in these communities, so that the renters, tenants in the retail and residential space, because a lot of times when we're talking about gentrifications, the winners are property owners, and that's great if they're Black property owners. But a lot of times minority people are renters. And so we're not really addressing the renting component and how new developments or any type of renovations increase rent. So we need policies to make sure that tenants are resilient in space of developments like that.
And they're not mutually exclusive. We'd have to, you're absolutely right, we do need to do that. but I think it is super important that one of the reasons why, since like one of the unintended consequences of the civil rights movement, and we've literally seen, families move out of what were racially segregated but economically diverse communities, is that we've actually helped create that dynamic of having way more renters, less property owners, right? And this just the history has shown that. So we do need to protect and support, in particular, people who have property, because we're losing that literally minute by minute in this country. And we also have to remember that many folks that do own properties, we're also, especially if we've got like duplexes, whatever, it's also another source of affordable housing that is often not even talked about in any real way. So it's like, again, not mutually exclusive at all, but that's why we have to like keep it going and make sure that we're addressing them all. But it's not to the extent where we have to like only focus on one and not the other.
You bring up a good point, Majora. I'm from the East Coast, and here in Los Angeles is a very sprawling environment. There's mostly single family homes. My family, I'm Jamaican, so shout out to my Jamaicans, very proud to be so. Hartford, Connecticut. So my family, my father grew up, didn't know how to read and write, still to this day. He came to this country and was able to build his wealth because he owned property that were 3 family story homes.
Me too.
So when you own that house, you rent out the other 2 floors and they are a source of income. And eventually, as you gain that money, you take that and you can move to wherever the hell you want, whether that be the suburbs or you buy another property, and it builds upon itself. Here in Los Angeles and in the Southern California area, and many other similar neighborhoods, it's very difficult to do that when that home price is $500,000, like Leslie said, and most people don't actually own those homes, they rent them. So that construct is very difficult to break when the economics don't work. Now, to go back to the question that was asked to Jamar before we open it up to the floor to questions, generally speaking, there is definitely a difference between gentrification and Black placekeeping and the evolution of that Black space. It's a dichotomy that is a relationship that designers, historically in this white profession of architecture and developing, must understand. Modernism has developed this idea of erasure and the practice of removing the city block in order to develop social housing and so have you. But when we look at the current state of our cities, we also must be aware of what that process needs to be. And one of the questions I want to throw at the panelists, you all don't have to answer this question, but so be it if you do. When we look at design justice or spatial justice, which is prioritizing the act of liberation for communities in the process of building space, and less so the priorities of the designer or the aesthetics that are wished upon by a developer. How does your work, or how do you envision a process that prioritizes that liberation for communities to be involved in the engagement of building their own spaces? Because we all know and we all have seen it, whether you go to South America or you even go to parts of LA, when people are forced to be given a little, they use that to develop space. Whether you look at the constructs of what a favela is and the verticality of that, people use that so much to go design buildings and put balconies on it. I mean, they are own like profit and reparations from that. But when you look at that construct, how do you develop a process that is different than what we've been accustomed to? Right now, when you send an RFP out, community engagement happens afterwards. So what do those processes look like for you all?
Well, I know for me, in regards to the policy work, it starts at the community level. It starts with impacted people. I know traditionally I feel like we're all familiar with trickle-down economics or trickle-down policy, where people at the top create things that they hope benefit people at the bottom in the best way. My hope is that we can flip that on its head and push it from trickle up economics, trickle up policy, where people at the bottom are really leading the conversation around solutions and are really being funded to do the work that they know needs to be done. A lot of community-based organizations represent power consolidated at the community level. So I believe community-based organizations are the entities that will leverage that conversation, have the intimate relationship with impacted people, and also have a great way of orienting them around these conversations and participation in them. So that's one way I feel centering impacted people. The other thing is really getting organizations and corporations to be authentic in their value representation. A lot of times you'll see like the city release sustainability reports, or they'll release a sustainability plan, the Green New Deal plan, the Our County plan that has all of these different components around what they plan to do around racial equity and achieving overhead canopies, or addressing food insecurity, or addressing the economic inequities that exist in our city, counties, and states. But how authentic are you in doing so when impacted people are not at the table? How authentic are you doing so when you're not funding the community-based organizations that you stifled those ideals from? How authentic are you doing so when we're going through an economic crisis right now and you're only supporting big business by expediting permits so that restaurants can sell liquor still and make bottom lines, when minority-owned business, small income business owners are not accessing the PPP loans, are not accessing the grants, are not accessing the loan opportunities, are not accessing these different components. So I think that kind of.
I'll build on to that to kind of sort of talk a little bit about the last conversation too, and answer your question, Chris, which is really housing is sort of at the critical sort of juncture of all this. You know, in our practice, a lot of what we do is working with affordable housing developers, you know, on various projects around Southern California, and you know, there's a lot of things that go into the need for housing, in particular at the affordable housing level, from supportive services, mental health, and you know, lots of different things that need to be addressed. But you know, something I heard the other day at the state level was that we're about 3.5 million units of housing short in the state of California. And there, you know, and there have been a number of different, you know, Senate bills, assembly bills that have been attempted to try to modify zoning, change legislation, change policies, change to incentivize, you know, more density in communities to start to address that housing shortage. And that's, you know, we need to continue to push on those efforts to really address the demand for housing, because when the demand is sort of supersedes the availability, that's where you get these incredible prices, such as, you know, $500,000 for a house, you know, right off of Crenshaw and Slauson. That's just going to be the reality of, you know, sort of the economic situation. But sort of tie it back to architecture for a second, housing, I think, is also really critical as architects. If we're not designing housing projects, housing developments, then we are sort of missing out on a significant portion of the industry. And in particular, when we're talking about Black and Brown communities, we need to be thinking about designing housing developments, participating in that process to really bring more housing to those communities where you can start to enable the sort of creations of generational wealth as someone can become their first time homeowner, all those sorts of things, and start to graduate into more developments. You know, a project that I'm working on right now up in Ventura, which is kind of an interesting example. It's a sort of 4 phases, and sort of the first 3 phases of the project are sort of more traditional affordable housing, subsidized housing. But the 4th phase is actually market rate housing, meant to be transitional housing for residents of the first 3 phases to hopefully accumulate enough money to purchase their first home and start to get out of that cycle of being, you know, always subsidized by the housing authority, you know, for the remainder of their lives. So it's created a number of units that are available to hopefully break that cycle and start to generate wealth that people can own and that, you know, can become a part of an asset in their family. So, you know, I would encourage everybody to sort of think about different types of developments, not just market rate, not just affordable housing, but, you know, ways that people could think about, you know, how to utilize housing as a stepping stone to grow our communities, bring more financial stability to Black and Brown communities. And in addition to that, all the health benefits that go with owning a home versus, you know, renting and everything else. The last piece I wanted to sort of throw out there is also, you know, a lot of the conversations today, and I'm sure tomorrow, will sort of center on how do we change a certain policy, or how do we get, you know, majority firms to make a change in the way that we do certain things, or how do we get somebody else to do something for us? And I'm saying us sort of most specifically to Black and Brown, you know, people who are attending today and in general. And I think we got to that's part of it. It's sort of a yes and equation where, sure, we need to obviously push on all those things, but if we are not sort of simultaneously pushing on sort of cooperative economics, self-empowerment, self-reliance, where we don't need to wait for the city to change a policy, we don't need to wait for a majority firm to hire a Black principal to represent the right design values in our communities. We have to do sort of all those things simultaneously. So I'm going to sort of close by saying, you know, we also need to be thinking about supporting Black-owned architecture firms to help them, you know, build these projects in our neighborhoods and our communities, and in any community for that matter, to really increase the sustainability of Black and brown people in the profession, which will then have a ripple impact into the spaces that are being built as well too.
Right. And absolutely, as far as the, you know, how do we get more, you know, of us in it, you know, again, not just the majority firms, but, you know, honestly, as a developer, my dream is to see way more people that look like me, actually way younger than I am, coming up and actually seeing themselves as developers, period. And because that really is also going to be the way, you know, as we're also building out architecture as well. But, you know, and I think the other, you know, piece that we want to talk about here is just there is a level of education, you know, specifically around what community resiliency means with regard to how money flows, you know, because it often is like somebody else is going to come in to do this work, to build the kind of housing we need to essentially save us. We even internally within our communities, we have this attitude. Whereas I know for a fact, because we've done it, whenever we, first of all, asking people, you know, what kind of community do you want to live in? You know, what are the assets in it that make you feel like you'd want to stay? So that, you know, asking that before we do anything, you know, as a developer, really important, but also helping folks see, you know, the differences, you know, of how they can even invest their money, you know, crowdfunding, investing in real estate development, as well as, you know, local business development. Huge. Actually, on your coast, there's an amazing group called East Bay Permanent Real Estate Collective. They're based in the Bay Area, but they do this cooperative way of buying land, you know, and basically people can buy shares in it, but it's a real estate development firm, period, straight up. You know, they have this really beautiful approach to land liberation, where it's like they're not doing the extractive exchange that happens within our communities, but it's creating a right exchange, because, you know, people should be paid fair market value for their homes. They should, you know, be able to develop business and charge a fair price and get what they need out of it. And so, but again, if we're not sharing with people, you know, how money moves, you know, what are the tools that everybody else uses, but we think that somebody else has to do because it's somehow, you know, above us or not something that we need to do, then we will always consistently be in sort of like running behind. And so now I think is the best time, you know, I think any time would be a good time, you know, to expect that policies are used in ways, access to capital, you know, for the type of what we need to do. That's what we need.
I want to, we are running so late, and I know people have got to get on with their day. I want to throw the last question to Gabrielle, who has had her hand up for about 20 minutes now.
I've been chomping at the bit. This has been a great conversation. I just want to touch on a couple of things. And one thing that you said, Leslie, about Destination Crunch on property housing prices being inflated. I do want to say, I want to go back to the practices that we all can engage, you know, working on Destination Crenshaw. It was very clear to us that cultural erasure was something to be aware of. And so one way around that is to have the community as a design partner, not just engagement, but a design partner, build ownership, pride, and all of that good stuff. And the other thing is the client and the team have been very careful. You know, a lot of this project has to do with private properties, public properties. And so we need those that own the private properties to allow us to have some of their property. And the client's very clear. If there's a property owner or a developer who is a known gentrifier, we will not engage them. We will not perpetuate the negative gentrification as much as we can. So I challenge all of us to know who our developers are. Who are we engaging to impact these communities? Because we have a responsibility. And the other thing about banking and home loans and how to have people retain their property, we had community meetings with the local banks, with large banks, to educate the community on what they can do to keep their property, to pass down to the grandchildren, encourage the grandchildren not to sell the property to the highest bidder. So I think all of those things, and for architects and urban designers, we can't stand by if we're involved in these projects, just let it happen, because then we are complicit. So with that, I have to go to a Destination Crenshaw meeting. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Me and Chris, we want to thank all of you, Ronell, Lance, Damar, and Majora, for this amazing conversation. Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. And Leslie, I just want to say I'm proud of you. You've been fantastic leading the effort. Will, thank you so much, and the rest of the AIA board, and all the NOMA folks on there as well, and all the familiar faces that I see. Lovely to be partaking in this energy with you all. I want to invite the panelists before they head out. Please put your contact information if you feel comfortable in the chat. So if people feel comfortable reaching out to you, they will do that. Majora is a developer and she does awesome things. So I'm pretty sure there's some great conversations happening there. Damar is running an awesome project here in LA, and I'm pretty sure he could use your money. So definitely hit him up. And Ronell is doing some awesome, great work as well in the brick and mortar policies that he's putting together. So I'm pretty damn sure he could use your help with that. And Lance, you already know Lance, this is the boss, president of SoCal NOMA. So definitely check him out if you haven't. Thank you all again. Will, do you want to wrap it up as we end this out?
Yeah, thank you, Christopher and Leslie. I want to unmute all of the people in this audience, and we'll do a big round of applause, and then we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8 in the morning for part 2. So thank you all for joining us today.